woman kneels in rags before the prince, wrongly accused and surrounded by nobles hungry for her punishment. But who she truly is will leave the entire court stunned, and the prince himself shattered. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The autumn wind swept through the courtyard of Thornfield Castle with a biting coldness that seemed to seep into the very stones of the ancient fortress. The sky above the northern reaches of medieval England hung heavy with gray clouds, promising rain before nightfall. Inside the great hall, however, warmth radiated from the massive stone hearth where flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows across the assembled nobles who had gathered for the monthly court proceedings. Prince Edmund Thornfield sat upon the elevated chair beside his father's empty throne, his posture rigid and his expression carved from the same unyielding stone as the castle walls. At 26 years of age, he was the very image of royal authority, with sharp features that spoke of generations of noble breeding, piercing gray eyes that missed nothing, and dark hair that fell just past his broad shoulders. His frame was powerful, built from years of training in the sword and shield, his shoulders wide beneath the heavy cloak of deep crimson wool lined with wolf fur that marked his station. The fabric was embroidered with intricate silver thread depicting the thornbush sigil of his house, and beneath it, he wore a tunic of black leather reinforced with subtle steel rings, practical yet elegant. A thick belt of worked leather cinched his waist, from which hung a longsword in a scabbard adorned with silver fittings. The prince's father, King Harold, had departed 3 weeks prior to inspect the northern borders where rumors of unrest had reached the capital, leaving Edmund to preside over matters of state in his absence. It was a responsibility the prince took with utmost seriousness, perhaps too much so, for his reputation among the common folk had grown increasingly cold with each passing season. Where his father balanced justice with mercy, Edmund saw only the letter of the law, unbending and absolute. The great hall itself was a testament to centuries of Thornfield rule, with high vaulted ceilings supported by massive wooden beams darkened with age and smoke. Tapestries depicting great battles and hunts hung from the walls, their colors muted by time but still magnificent in their detail. The stone floor was covered with fresh rushes mixed with herbs that released their fragrance when stepped upon, a small comfort against the perpetual chill that inhabited such ancient spaces. Tall windows of leaded glass allowed gray daylight to filter through, supplemented by dozens of candles in iron sconces that lined the walls. The assembled nobles stood in their designated positions according to rank and favor, each dressed in their finest garments. Lord Pemberton wore a doublet of forest green velvet with gold embroidery, his considerable belly straining against the fabric. Lady Catherine, wife of the Lord Chancellor, was resplendent in a gown of deep blue wool with sleeves that draped nearly to the floor, the neckline trimmed with ermine. Her daughter, Lady Anne, stood beside her in a dress of pale rose, her eyes fixed on the prince with barely concealed admiration that Edmund pointedly ignored. The younger lords and knights wore various combinations of leather and fine wool, many with swords at their hips, their cloaks fastened with brooches bearing their house symbols. The proceedings had been underway since dawn, dealing with the usual matters of disputed lands, marriage contracts, and minor grievances between noble houses. Edmund handled each case with mechanical efficiency, his judgments swift and his words clipped. The assembled courtiers had learned not to expect warmth from their prince, only cold justice. Some whispered that he lacked his father's common touch, that he saw the people as pieces on a game board rather than living souls with hopes and fears. But none dared voice such criticism where it might reach royal ears. The morning stretched toward midday when a commotion arose near the great doors of the hall. The sound of raised voices and scuffling feet echoed through the space, causing heads to turn and conversations to halt. Edmund's hand moved instinctively toward the hilt of his sword as the doors burst open, revealing 2 of the castle guards dragging a struggling figure between them. "Your Highness," called out Sir Geoffrey, the captain of the guard, his weathered face flushed with exertion. "We've apprehended a thief attempting to steal from the castle stores. We caught her red-handed with a sack of grain and dried meat." The figure between the guards ceased struggling as they hauled her forward into the center of the hall. As she was forced to her knees on the rush-covered floor, the assembled nobles drew closer, forming a circle of richly dressed observers around the accused. Edmund leaned forward in his seat, his gray eyes narrowing as he studied the prisoner. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24 years, and even in her disheveled state, there was something striking about her appearance that caused several of the younger lords to exchange glances. Her hair was a rich chestnut brown, long and thick, though currently tangled and dusted with what appeared to be flour from the storerooms. It cascaded over her shoulders in waves that caught the firelight despite their disarray. Her face, though smudged with dirt and marked by exhaustion, possessed a natural beauty that transcended her current circumstances. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and full lips that even now pressed together in defiant silence, rather than pleading for mercy. But it was her eyes that drew the most attention, large and expressive, the color of warm amber, framed by dark lashes. They blazed with an inner fire that spoke of spirit unbroken, despite her obvious poverty and present predicament. Her clothing told the story of her station more clearly than any words could. She wore a simple dress of rough-spun wool, the color long since faded to an indeterminate gray-brown, patched in several places with cloth that didn't quite match. The hem was caked with mud and the sleeves were worn thin at the elbows. Over this, she had a shawl of even coarser fabric, more holes than whole cloth, that provided little protection against the autumn chill. Her feet were wrapped in strips of leather held together with twine, barely qualifying as shoes. Yet, despite the poverty of her attire, there was something about the way she held herself, even on her knees before the prince, that suggested an inner dignity that circumstances could not completely erase. Edmund rose slowly from his seat, his crimson cloak falling around him like a cascade of blood as he descended the 3 stone steps to the main floor of the hall. His boots, fine leather worked to a soft sheen, made no sound on the rushes as he approached the kneeling woman. The courtiers parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, their eyes darting between their prince and the accused, eager for the entertainment that such proceedings often provided. "Look at me," Edmund commanded, his voice carrying easily through the now silent hall. It was a voice accustomed to obedience, deep and resonant, with the clear diction of one educated by the finest tutors. The woman kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her jaw clenched. One of the guards grabbed a handful of her hair, yanking her head back sharply, forcing her to meet the prince's gaze. She gasped at the sudden pain, but still did not cry out, a detail that Edmund registered with a flicker of something he couldn't quite name before dismissing it. "I said, 'Look at me,'" Edmund repeated, his tone growing colder. "When your prince addresses you, peasant, you will show proper respect." Her amber eyes met his gray ones, and for a moment something passed between them, a crackle of tension that several of the more observant courtiers noted with interest. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by Edmund's mask of cold authority and the woman's carefully blank expression. "What is your name?" Edmund demanded, circling around her slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. His movements were predatory, like a wolf examining prey, and the watching nobles edged closer, not wanting to miss a single moment of the drama unfolding before them. "Ilara," she said finally, her voice surprisingly steady despite her position. It was a pleasant voice, cultured beyond what one might expect from a peasant woman, though roughened by what might have been hunger or thirst. "Ilara of Ashford Village, Your Highness." "Ilara of Ashford," Edmund repeated, letting each word fall like a stone into still water. "And you thought it appropriate to steal from your prince's stores? You thought the laws that govern every subject in this realm somehow did not apply to you?" "I took only what I needed to survive, my lord," Ilara replied, and there was no pleading in her tone, only a simple statement of fact. "My mother is ill, dying of the fever that has swept through our village. The harvest failed this year because of the early frost, and our stores are empty. I came seeking mercy, hoping to petition for aid, but the guards at the gate turned me away. They said the prince had no time for peasant complaints. So yes, I took food, because watching my mother starve when there is plenty within these walls seemed a greater crime than theft." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles at her words, some shocked by her audacity in speaking so directly to the prince, others impressed by her courage in the face of certain punishment. Edmund felt his jaw tighten, anger rising hot in his chest. How dare this woman, this common thief, attempt to justify her crimes and place blame at his feet? How dare she suggest that he was somehow responsible for her circumstances? "You speak of crime," Edmund said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Let me educate you on the nature of crime, peasant. Crime is taking what does not belong to you. Crime is violating the laws established to maintain order in civilized society. Crime is standing before your prince and having the audacity to suggest that your need justifies theft. He moved closer now, standing directly before her, forcing her to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into her features, the hollows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of missed meals, the shadows under her eyes that told of sleepless nights. Some distant part of him registered these signs of suffering, but he pushed the observation aside, refusing to let sympathy cloud his judgment. Your Highness, Sir Geoffrey interjected, stepping forward. Shall I take her to the dungeons to await sentencing? We have several other matters that require your attention this morning. Edmund held up one hand, silencing the captain without taking his eyes from Ilara's face. No, he said slowly, a cruel smile beginning to curve his lips. I think this matter requires more immediate attention. After all, this woman has so graciously provided us with an opportunity to remind everyone present of what happens when the law is broken, when theft is committed against the crown. He turned away from her then, addressing the assembled courtiers with the commanding presence that had been drilled into him since childhood. Let this be a lesson to all who might consider following this woman's example. The law applies to everyone, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant. There are no exceptions, no special circumstances that permit breaking the king's peace. This woman has confessed to theft. The punishment for stealing from the royal stores is well established. 50 lashes and a month in the dungeons, Lord Pemberton called out helpfully, his jowls quivering with eagerness. And branding. Don't forget the branding, Your Highness. A thief must be marked so all might know what she is. Indeed, Edmund agreed, nodding slowly. Though I think perhaps we should enhance the punishment. Given her remarkable lack of remorse, perhaps 60 lashes would be more appropriate. And yes, the branding, certainly. We wouldn't want her to forget this lesson after all. Please, Ilara said, and for the first time her voice cracked slightly. Not with fear for herself, Edmund noted, but with something else. Please, Your Highness, I care nothing for my own fate. But my mother, she needs help. If you must punish someone, punish me. But I beg you, send aid to Ashford village. The sickness there is spreading, and people are dying. Is that not the duty of a prince, to protect his people? The silence that followed her words was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the whistle of wind through the high windows. Every eye in the hall was fixed on Edmund, waiting to see how he would respond to such a direct challenge to his authority. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the anticipation that hung in the air like smoke. Edmund's expression hardened into something carved from ice. The duty of a prince, he said, each word precisely enunciated, is to maintain order and enforce the law. If your village is suffering, it is because of poor planning, laziness, or perhaps divine judgment for sins committed. The crown provides protection from enemies foreign and domestic, but it is not responsible for the failures of peasants to adequately prepare for winter. He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as something crumbled behind Ilara's eyes, some last hope extinguishing like a candle flame. Good, he thought. Let her learn that tears and pleas would not move him from the path of justice. Furthermore, Edmund continued, warming to his subject now, your audacity in standing before this court and lecturing me on duty is itself a crime. You forget your place, woman. You are nothing. A peasant, a thief. You have no right to question the actions or decisions of your betters. The fact that you cannot seem to grasp this fundamental truth suggests that perhaps 60 lashes are insufficient to teach you proper humility. Lady Catherine gasped softly, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture of shock that was probably at least partially performative. Her daughter Anne looked away, suddenly finding the tapestries fascinating. Some of the younger lords shifted uncomfortably, though whether from genuine discomfort or merely the awkwardness of witnessing such a thorough dressing down, Edmund neither knew nor cared. Look at you, Edmund said, moving closer again, his voice dripping with contempt. He gestured at her worn clothing, her muddy foot wraps, her tangled hair. You come before this court dressed in rags, covered in filth, and expect what? Sympathy? Understanding? You are exactly what you appear to be. a common criminal who thought she could steal from her prince and escape justice by spinning a tale of woe. Ilara's hands, which had been clasped in her lap, clenched into fists. Her amber eyes, which had shown such fire earlier, now brimmed with unshed tears, though whether they were tears of sorrow, rage, or frustration, Edmund could not tell. Her breathing had quickened, her chest rising and falling beneath the rough fabric of her dress, and there was a tremble running through her frame that she seemed to be fighting to control. How many others, I wonder, Edmund mused, circling her again like a predator, have spun similar tales? How many have claimed sickness in their families, failed harvests, desperate circumstances? And if I showed mercy to each one, if I allowed sentiment to override law, what would happen? Chaos, disorder, the complete breakdown of the very structures that keep civilization intact. No, better that one woman suffer than the entire realm descend into lawlessness. He stopped in front of her again, bending slightly so that his face was level with hers. Do you understand now? Your suffering, your mother's illness, your village's problems, they mean nothing compared to the greater good of maintaining order. You are a lesson, nothing more. A reminder to all present and to whatever rabble might hear of this day that the crown's justice is absolute and inescapable. Your Highness, a voice called from the back of the hall, cutting through the tension like a blade. The assembled nobles turned as one, and Edmund straightened, irritation flashing across his features at the interruption. An elderly man pushed his way through the crowd, his movements urgent despite his obvious age. He wore the simple brown robes of a scholar, belted at the waist with rope, and carried a leather satchel across his shoulder. His hair was white as fresh snow, his face deeply lined, but his blue eyes were sharp and clear. "Master Cedric," Edmund said, his tone making clear that the interruption was unwelcome. "This is hardly the time for scholarly concerns. As you can see, we are in the middle of dispensing justice." "Forgive me, Your Highness," the old man said, bowing deeply, "but I must speak with you urgently on a matter of great importance. It concerns the prisoner." Edmund's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The prisoner is of no concern to you, Master Cedric. She is a common thief who will receive the punishment prescribed by law. Now, if you have no other business, I suggest you return to your books and allow me to complete this proceeding." But Cedric did not retreat. Instead, he moved closer, his eyes flickering between Edmund and Ilara with an expression of growing recognition and something that might have been alarm. "Your Highness, I must insist. If I might have just a moment of your time in private, I believe you will find what I have to say most urgent." The prince's jaw clenched, his patience clearly wearing thin. Around them, the courtiers whispered among themselves, speculation running wild about what could possibly make the old scholar risk the prince's wrath by interrupting such a proceeding. Master Cedric was well known in the castle, having served as tutor to Edmund himself in his youth, and later as the keeper of the royal archives. He was generally regarded as harmless, if somewhat eccentric, preferring the company of ancient manuscripts to that of people. "Whatever you have to say can be said here, before the entire court," Edmund declared, his voice brooking no argument. "I will not have it said that Prince Edmund Thornfield conducts private conferences while justice is being served. Speak now, or hold your peace." Master Cedric's weathered face creased with worry, but he nodded slowly. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. As he unwrapped it, revealing a ring of silver with an intricate design, several of the older nobles leaned forward, their expressions shifting from casual interest to shocked recognition. "Your Highness," Cedric began, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall, "3 weeks ago, shortly after your father departed for the northern borders, a messenger arrived at the castle gates. He was badly wounded, having been attacked by bandits on the road from the west. Before he died of his injuries, he entrusted this ring to my care, along with a message for the king. The message was that Lady Helena, wife of Lord Thomas of Westmarch, had died giving birth to their daughter 24 years ago, or so it was believed at the time." Edmund felt a cold sensation beginning to spread through his chest, though he could not yet articulate why. He stared at the ring in Cedric's palm, noting the design, a rose entwined with a sword, the sigil of House Westmarch. "Get to the point, Master Cedric. What does this ancient history have to do with the matter at hand? Lord Thomas died in battle against the Scottish raiders 15 years ago, as you well know," Cedric continued, his voice heavy with significance. "He was your father's closest friend and most trusted advisor. What you may not know, what very few people knew, was that Lady Helena did not actually die in childbirth. She survived, but she was very ill, and there were complications. Lord Thomas, fearing for her safety during a time of great unrest in the realm, made a difficult decision. He sent his wife and newborn daughter away to a small village far from the intrigues of court, to live in secret under the protection of a trusted servant family. The silence in the hall had taken on a quality of breathless anticipation. Edmund felt as though the ground beneath his feet had suddenly become unstable, though he maintained his rigid posture through sheer force of will. His eyes moved involuntarily to Alara, who still knelt on the floor, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension, and something that might have been horror. "That village," Cedric said, his voice dropping lower but losing none of its clarity, "was Ashford. The trusted servant family was named Moore, and the child, who would now be 24 years old, was named Alara." The explosion of sound that followed was immediate and deafening. The assembled nobles erupted into shocked exclamations, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and excitement. Several of the ladies gasped and clutched at their companions. Lord Pemberton's face had gone pale, his earlier enthusiasm for punishment suddenly evaporated. Lady Catherine stared at Alara with wide eyes, her hand still pressed to her throat as though she might faint at any moment. Edmund stood frozen, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. It couldn't be true. It was impossible. The woman kneeling before him, this thief in rags with mud on her face and desperation in her eyes, could not possibly be Lady Alara of House Westmarch, daughter of his father's dearest friend and oldest ally. It was absurd. It was unthinkable. "You lie," Edmund said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He could hear the uncertainty creeping in at the edges, and he hated it. This is some elaborate deception, some scheme. The girl is clearly a peasant. Look at her. Look at how she speaks, how she carries herself. "How she speaks?" Cedric repeated, raising his eyebrows. "You mean with the clear diction and educated vocabulary that you yourself noted seemed unusual for someone of her supposed station? How she carries herself? You mean with dignity and bearing that persists even in the face of humiliation and threat of violence? Your Highness, have you been so blinded by your assumptions that you could not see what was before your eyes?" The old scholar moved toward Alara now, kneeling beside her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the rough treatment she had received from the guards. "May I see your hand, my dear?" he asked softly. Alara, who had been silent since Cedric's revelation, seemed to be in a state of shock. Her face had gone pale, her amber eyes enormous in her face. She extended her hand slowly as though moving through water, and Cedric took it gently, turning it palm up. There, on the inside of her wrist, was a small birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon. Lady Helena had an identical mark in the same location, Cedric said, looking up at Edmund. "It runs in the bloodline of House Westmarch, appearing once every few generations. Lord Thomas showed it to me himself when his daughter was born, expressing his joy that she bore the family mark." Edmund felt as though he had been struck in the chest. The blood drained from his face as the full weight of what he had done crashed down upon him like an avalanche. He had humiliated her. He had called her nothing, a common thief, filth, rabble. He had sentenced her to 60 lashes and a branding. He had mocked her suffering and dismissed her pleas for help as lies and manipulation. And all the while, she had been the daughter of his father's dearest friend, a noble lady who should have been living in luxury and honor, not struggling to survive in a forgotten village. "No," Edmund whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. "No, this cannot be." But even as he spoke, he could see the truth of it now that the scales had fallen from his eyes. The way she held herself, the quality of her speech, the fire in her eyes that spoke of breeding and spirit, it had all been there, and he had been too arrogant, too convinced of his own judgment to see it. He had looked at her poor clothing and assumed poverty of character. He had seen her desperation and assumed criminality. He had been so certain of his righteousness that he had become blind to reality. Alara was staring at her own hand as though she had never seen it before, her breathing rapid and shallow. "My mother," she said, her voice barely audible. "Margaret Moore, the woman I have called mother all my life. She never told me. She never said anything about any of this. She told me I was her daughter, that my father had died when I was an infant. She told me we were simple people, that we should be grateful for what we had. She never. Her voice broke, and for the first time since being dragged into the hall, tears began to stream down her face. They carved clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks, falling onto her clasped hands where they glistened in the firelight. She's dying, Ilara continued, her voice rising with anguish. The woman who raised me, who loved me, who sacrificed everything to keep me safe. She's dying, and I came here to save her. I came here to beg for help, and instead I was turned away like trash, and now. She couldn't continue. The sobs overtook her, racking her thin frame with their force. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of a world turned upside down, of every certainty stripped away and replaced with confusion and pain. The assembled nobles watched in uncomfortable silence, many of them looking away, unable to meet the eyes of their prince, who stood as still as a statue, his face a mask of horror and shame. Master Cedric placed a gentle hand on Ilara's shoulder, offering what comfort he could. Lady Helena, your true mother, did die of her illness when you were 5 years old, he said softly. Lord Thomas wanted to bring you back to court then, but the realm was in turmoil. There were plots against the king, assassinations, betrayals. He feared for your safety. He thought it better to leave you hidden, protected, until the danger passed. But then he fell in battle, and the secret of your location died with him. Or so he thought. It seems he left instructions with a trusted messenger to be delivered to the king should he not return. But that messenger never reached the capital. Perhaps he was killed, or perhaps he simply disappeared. We searched, but found nothing. He paused, his old eyes sad. Margaret Moore, the woman you knew as your mother, she must have loved you very much to never tell you the truth. Perhaps she feared that knowing would put you in danger. Perhaps she simply came to think of you as her own daughter and could not bear to lose you. We may never know her reasons now. Edmund found his voice at last, though it sounded strange to his own ears, stripped of all its earlier authority and conviction. The fever in Ashford Village, he said, forcing the words out. Is it truly so bad? Ilara looked up at him, and the expression in her eyes cut him more deeply than any sword could have. It was not hatred, which he might have expected and perhaps deserved. It was not even anger. It was disappointment, a profound sadness that spoke of hopes dashed and faith broken. 37 people have died in the last month, she said quietly, most of them children and elderly. The village healer does what she can, but she has no medicines, no supplies. We sent word to the castle 3 times, begging for aid, but received no response. So yes, your highness, it is truly so bad. Why did I receive no word of this? Edmund demanded, turning on Sir Geoffrey with sudden fury. The captain of the guard took a step back, his weathered face flushing with alarm. Your highness, we received petitions from several villages. Geoffrey stammered. There is always sickness in the autumn, always requests for aid. I thought it best not to trouble you with such minor matters while you managed affairs of state in the king's absence. The procedure is to refer such requests to the Lord Steward for evaluation, and the Lord Steward is in the north with my father. Edmund finished, his voice deadly quiet. So these petitions simply sat unread and unanswered while people died. He turned away from the guard, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The weight of his failure was crushing, a physical thing that threatened to drive him to his knees. He had prided himself on his justice, his adherence to law and order, his refusal to be swayed by sentiment, and in doing so, he had allowed dozens of his father's subjects to die through simple neglect. He had turned away a noble woman seeking help and treated her worse than an animal. He had been so certain of his righteousness that he had become the very thing he despised, a tyrant who valued rules over lives. The hall remained silent, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something momentous, a turning point whose consequences would ripple far beyond this single day. Lady Anne had tears streaming down her own face, her hands pressed to her mouth. Lord Pemberton looked as though he might be sick. Even the guards who had dragged Ilara into the hall looked stricken, realizing their own part in the catastrophe that had unfolded. Edmund drew a deep breath, steadying himself. He was still the prince. He had made a terrible mistake, perhaps the worst of his life, but he was still responsible for these people, for this realm. He could not simply collapse under the weight of his shame, no matter how much he might wish to. He had to act, had to try to make this right, even if he suspected that nothing he could do would truly accomplish that. "Master Cedric," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "take Lady Alara to the royal apartments. See that she is given everything she needs. A bath, food, clothing appropriate to her station. Summon the court physician to examine her and ensure she has taken no lasting harm, and send messengers to every healer and physician within a day's ride. They are to gather medicines and supplies and depart for Ashford Village immediately. I will provide funds from the royal treasury to cover all expenses." He paused, then added, "I will accompany them personally to oversee the relief efforts and to see the woman who raised Lady Alara, to thank her for her service and to ensure she receives the best care available." Alara was staring at him now, her tear-stained face unreadable. "You need not trouble yourself, Your Highness," she said, and there was a brittleness to her words, a barely contained emotion that might have been rage or grief or both. "You have made your opinion of me quite clear. I would not wish to impose further on your valuable time with my peasant concerns." The words struck like blows, each one landing with precision on Edmund's already wounded conscience. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had not known, that everything would have been different if he had known her true identity. But even as the thoughts formed, he recognized them for what they were, hollow justifications that changed nothing. He had judged her based on her appearance and her circumstances. He had assumed the worst because it was easier than questioning his own certainty. The fact that she was actually a noblewoman did not change the fundamental cruelty of what he had done. It only made it impossible to ignore. "Lady Alara," he began, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Do not call me that," she said, rising to her feet with as much dignity as her worn dress and exhausted state would allow. Master Cedric tried to support her, but she gently pushed his hand away, standing on her own. "I do not know who that person is. I am Alara of Ashford Village, daughter of Margaret Moore in all the ways that matter. That woman lying sick unto death in a cottage with a leaking roof. She is my mother. She fed me when I was hungry, held me when I cried, taught me to read and write and think and question. She loved me without reservation or condition. So yes, I will accept your aid because my village needs it desperately, because people are dying who should not have to die. But do not think for one moment that your sudden concern springs from genuine compassion. You care only because you have been forced to confront the fact that you humiliated someone of noble birth. Had I truly been nothing more than a peasant, you would have proceeded with your punishment without a second thought." The silence that followed Alara's words was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind howling around the castle's towers. Edmund stood motionless, her accusation hanging in the air between them like a drawn sword. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself against the charge that his concern was merely a matter of social station rather than genuine remorse. But the words died in his throat because, beneath all his other emotions, he recognized the uncomfortable truth in what she said. Would he have been so quick to offer aid if Master Cedric had not revealed her identity? Would he have felt this crushing weight of shame if she had been merely a peasant woman with a dying mother? He wanted to believe he would have, but the honest answer was that he did not know, and that uncertainty was perhaps more damning than any definitive answer could have been. "You are right," Edmund said finally, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. Around them, the assembled nobles stirred in shock. Prince Edmund Thornfield did not admit to being wrong. He did not concede points or acknowledge failures. Yet here he stood, before the entire court, doing exactly that. "You are absolutely right. I judged you based on your appearance and your station. I assumed criminality because it fit my preconceived notions of how the world works. And yes, learning your true identity has forced me to confront my own cruelty in a way I might not have otherwise." He took a step toward her, then stopped, recognizing that any closer approach might be unwelcome. "But I would ask you to consider this, Lady Alara, or simply Alara if you prefer. You have just learned that everything you believed about your identity was a lie. You discovered that the woman you called mother, while clearly loving, kept a monumental secret from you your entire life. You found out that you are the daughter of a great lord, born to privilege and position, yet raised in poverty and obscurity. These revelations have shaken your understanding of yourself and your place in the world." He paused, his gray eyes meeting her amber ones with an intensity that made several courtiers lean forward to better observe the exchange. In the same way, You have shaken my understanding of myself. I believed I was just, that I ruled with fairness and according to law. I believed my judgments were sound and my methods righteous. You have shown me, in the space of a single morning, that I was wrong, that my justice was cruel, my fairness selective, and my righteousness nothing more than arrogance wrapped in the trappings of authority. This is not an easy thing to accept, but I am trying to accept it nonetheless. Ilara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The tears had stopped flowing, though their tracks remained visible on her face, and her breathing had steadied. When she spoke, her voice was calmer, though no less firm. Pretty words, Your Highness. But words are easy. Actions are what matter. You say you have learned something today, that you recognize your cruelty and your failures. Very well. Then let us see if these lessons translate into meaningful change, or if they are merely temporary discomfort that will fade as soon as I am no longer here to remind you of your shame. Before Edmund could respond, Master Cedric stepped forward, his aged face creased with concern. Lady Ilara, please, you are exhausted and distressed. Allow me to escort you to chambers where you can rest and recover from this ordeal. These matters can be discussed further once you have had time to process everything that has happened. Ilara shook her head firmly. No, I appreciate your concern, Master Cedric, truly. But I did not come to this castle seeking rest or comfort for myself. I came seeking help for my village, for my mother. That need has not changed, regardless of what I have learned about my birth. I will not retire to comfortable chambers while people I love are suffering and dying. The relief expedition is being organized as we speak, Edmund interjected. Sir Geoffrey, how long before we can depart? The captain of the guard, who had been standing at rigid attention since his earlier reprimand, snapped to attention. Your Highness, to gather sufficient supplies and personnel to prepare horses and wagons, it will require at least until tomorrow morning. We cannot simply rush off unprepared. The road to Ashford Village is a full day's journey, perhaps more if the weather turns. We need to ensure we have everything necessary to provide proper aid. Tomorrow morning, Ilara repeated, and there was a desperate edge to her voice now. My mother may not have until tomorrow morning. She was barely conscious when I left 3 days ago. Every hour I delay here could be the difference between life and death. Edmund felt his chest tighten at the anguish in her voice. 3 days? You traveled for 3 days on foot to reach the castle? Of course on foot, Ilara said, a bitter smile crossing her lips. Did you imagine I had a horse? The village has 2 draft horses for plowing, and they are needed for what little field work remains before winter. I walked, Your Highness, through rain and cold, sleeping in ditches and under trees, eating what berries and roots I could find along the way. I arrived at the castle gates yesterday evening, but the guards would not let me in. They said to return in the morning when court was in session. So I spent the night huddled against the outer wall, trying to stay warm, and when morning came, I was so desperate that I did what I did. The image her words painted was devastating. While Edmund had slept in his comfortable bed beneath warm furs, she had been pressed against the cold stone of his castle wall. While he had broken his fast with fresh bread and honey, she had been scrounging for food. And when she had finally taken the desperate action of stealing to save someone she loved, he had responded with cruelty and condemnation. Then we leave immediately, Edmund declared, his voice carrying the tone of absolute command that the courtiers recognized all too well. Sir Geoffrey, prepare my horse and a mount for Lady Ilara. We ride ahead with whatever supplies can be gathered in the next hour. Send the main relief expedition after us tomorrow with the healers and additional provisions. Your Highness, Lord Pemberton spoke up, his considerable bulk seeming to quiver with alarm. Surely you cannot mean to travel with such insufficient preparation, and to ride alone with a woman, without proper escort or chaperone. It would be most improper. Think of the scandal. Edmund turned to face the Lord, and the expression on his face made Pemberton take an involuntary step backward. Scandal? Edmund repeated, his voice dangerously soft. You dare speak to me of scandal when a noble woman of this realm has been living in poverty for 24 years because we failed to protect her? When people are dying of fever because I was too arrogant to read their petitions? When I very nearly ordered a lady flogged and branded for the crime of trying to save her mother's life? That is scandal, Lord Pemberton. What I choose to do to rectify these failures is none of your concern. He turned back to Ilara. Can you ride? I know you walked here, but if you have ever learned, we can reach Ashford in half the time on horseback. My father, Lord Thomas, taught me before he died, Alara said softly, and Edmund could hear the wonder in her voice as she spoke the name, trying it out, testing how it felt to say, my father, and mean someone other than a man she had never known. Or at least, that is what Margaret told me. She said a nobleman passing through the village took interest in me when I was very small and taught me to ride his horse. I always thought it was merely a kind stranger. I never imagined it was actually my father coming to visit in secret. Her voice caught on the last words, and Edmund saw her hand move to her mouth as though to hold back a sob. The revelation was clearly still so raw, the implication still unfolding in her mind. She had lost a mother and gained a father in the space of an hour, and the father she gained was already dead, leaving her only questions and a past she could never fully know. Then it is settled, Edmund said, gentling his tone as much as he was able. We ride within the hour. Master Cedric, please ensure that Lady Alara is provided with suitable riding clothes and a warm cloak, and prepare a bag with basic medical supplies, whatever can be gathered quickly. If her mother's condition is as dire as she suggests, every moment counts. As the old scholar led Alara toward the doors of the great hall, she paused and looked back at Edmund. Thank you, she said, and though the words were simple, they carried a complexity of emotion that Edmund could not fully parse. Gratitude, yes, but also skepticism, residual anger, and something that might have been the faintest glimmer of hope that perhaps he was capable of being more than the cruel prince she had encountered this morning. When they had gone, Edmund turned to address the assembled courtiers, who had been watching the entire exchange with rapt attention. He could see the speculation in their eyes, the gossip already forming on their tongues. By nightfall, every person in the castle would know what had transpired in the great hall. By week's end, the story would have spread to every corner of the realm, doubtless growing more elaborate with each retelling. Let me be clear, Edmund said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. What you witnessed here today was a failure of justice, a failure of leadership, and a failure of basic human decency. I take full responsibility for these failures. When my father returns, I will inform him of everything that has occurred and accept whatever consequences he deems appropriate. In the meantime, I expect every person in this castle to treat Lady Alara with the respect and courtesy due to her station. Anyone who fails to do so will answer to me personally. Is that understood? A chorus of, "Yes, Your Highness," echoed through the hall, though Edmund could see the confusion on many faces. This was not the prince they knew, the cold and unyielding enforcer of law and order. This was someone different, someone uncertain, and, for perhaps the first time in his life, genuinely humble in the face of his own limitations. Court is dismissed, Edmund declared. Sir Geoffrey, attend me. We have preparations to make. As the nobles filed out of the great hall in clusters of animated conversation, Edmund stood alone by the fire, staring into the flames. In the dancing light, he thought he could see the image of Alara's face, her amber eyes bright with unshed tears, her voice steady as she called him out for his cruelty. He had humiliated her, belittled her, threatened her with violence and pain, all while she had been trying to save someone she loved. And through it all, she had maintained her dignity with a strength that he was forced to admire, even as it shamed him. Sir Geoffrey approached cautiously, clearing his throat. Your Highness, about the preparations. Geoffrey? Edmund interrupted, still staring at the fire. How many other petitions were set aside as unimportant? How many other villages have sent word of sickness or hunger or bandits, only to have their pleas ignored because they were deemed too minor to deserve attention? The captain shifted uncomfortably. Your Highness, I cannot say for certain. Perhaps 24 such requests have come in the past month. 24, Edmund repeated softly. 24 opportunities to help people who needed it, and we dismissed them all, because we were too busy with matters of state, because peasant problems are beneath the notice of princes, because we have forgotten that every subject of this realm, noble or common, deserves to be heard and protected. He turned to face Geoffrey, and the older man was startled by the intensity in the prince's eyes. When we return from Ashford, you and I are going to review every single one of those petitions, and we are going to respond to every single one, even if it takes weeks, even if it means I sleep 4 hours a night and work until my hands cramp from writing. We are going to fix this, Geoffrey. We are going to do better." "Yes, Your Highness," Geoffrey said, and there was something in his weathered face that might have been approval, or perhaps relief. "I will see to the preparations for the journey. We will be ready to depart within the hour." As the captain hurried off to fulfill his orders, Edmund remained by the fire, his mind churning with thoughts that refused to settle into any coherent pattern. He kept returning to the moment when he had realized the truth, when the scales had fallen from his eyes, and he had seen Alara not as a common thief, but as a person, a noble woman, someone worthy of consideration and respect. The shame of that moment would stay with him for a long time, he knew. But more disturbing was the question that kept circling in his mind like a carrion bird. Would he have cared if she had truly been a peasant? Would her mother's illness have mattered to him if Margaret Moore had been simply a commoner with no connection to nobility? Would he have ordered the relief expedition, the gathering of supplies, the personal journey to provide aid? Or would he have proceeded with the punishment, secure in his righteousness, never questioning whether justice and cruelty might sometimes wear the same face? He did not like the answer that his honest self whispered in the quiet of his thoughts. He did not like it at all, and yet perhaps that discomfort was necessary. Perhaps it was the beginning of the kind of change that Alara had challenged him to make, the transformation from words to actions, from temporary guilt to lasting growth. The hour passed swiftly as the castle erupted into organized chaos. Servants rushed through corridors carrying bundles and bags. Stable hands prepared horses and checked their equipment. The castle physician packed medicines and bandages into leather satchels. And in the chambers that had been hastily prepared for Alara, Master Cedric supervised as maids brought warm water for washing and laid out clothing suitable for riding. When Edmund arrived at the stables, he found his black destrier already saddled and waiting, along with a smaller gray mare that would serve as Alara's mount. Both horses were equipped with supplies tied behind the saddles, compact bundles that contained food, water, basic medical supplies, and blankets. It was far less than what the full relief expedition would carry tomorrow, but it would have to suffice. Alara emerged from the castle wearing clothes that transformed her appearance so completely that Edmund found himself momentarily speechless. Gone was the rough-spun dress and tattered shawl. In their place, she wore riding clothes of soft leather dyed a deep brown, practical and well-fitted, with a tunic of cream-colored wool beneath. Over this, she had a cloak of thick gray wool lined with rabbit fur, fastened at the throat with a simple silver clasp. Her hair had been washed and braided, hanging down her back in a thick plait that gleamed like polished wood in the afternoon light. The dirt had been scrubbed from her face, revealing the true beauty of her features, the high cheekbones and clear skin that spoke of noble breeding. But it was not just her appearance that had changed. There was something in the way she carried herself now, a subtle shift in bearing that came from having an identity affirmed rather than hidden. She was still exhausted, still worried, still angry, Edmund suspected, but there was a new element to her presence, a claiming of space and authority that had been suppressed before. The clothes fit well, Edmund observed as Alara approached the horses, her steps confident despite the obvious fatigue that still marked her features. Master Cedric has always had an excellent eye for such details. "They belong to your sister, I am told," Alara replied, running her hand along the gray mare's neck, in a gesture that was both soothing to the animal and seemed to calm her own nerves. "Princess Margaret, who died of the same fever that now plagues my village 5 years ago." The servants seemed reluctant to part with them, but Master Cedric insisted. Edmund felt a pang at the mention of his sister, whose death had been one of the great sorrows of his life. Margaret had been bright and kind, everything he was not, and her loss had left a void in the castle that had never truly been filled. "She would have wanted you to have them," he said softly. Margaret believed in helping others, in using what privilege she had to ease suffering. "She would have been horrified by what I did to you this morning." Alara looked at him directly, her amber eyes searching his face as though trying to read his sincerity. "Then perhaps you should honor her memory by becoming more like her, and less like the man who stood in that hall and called me nothing." The words were delivered without malice, but they struck deep nonetheless. Edmund nodded slowly, accepting the rebuke as deserved. "That is my intention," he said, "though I suspect intentions alone will not be enough. It will require sustained effort and a willingness to question assumptions I have held for my entire life. Then let us hope you possess such willingness, Ilara said, turning her attention back to the mare, because I do not think I could bear to watch you return to your old ways once the immediate crisis has passed and your guilt has faded into comfortable distance. Sir Geoffrey approached, leading 2 additional horses bearing supplies. Your Highness, everything is prepared. I have assigned 4 guards to accompany you for protection on the road. The main expedition will depart at dawn tomorrow with additional healers and provisions. Edmund shook his head. No guards. Lady Ilara and I will ride alone. Your Highness, I must protest. Geoffrey began, his weathered face creasing with concern. The roads are not safe. There have been reports of bandits, and traveling with so few, it would be extremely dangerous. The bandits prey on merchants and travelers they perceive as wealthy, Edmund replied, swinging up into his saddle with practiced ease. The black destrier shifted beneath him, eager to run after hours confined to the stable. A prince traveling with full escort would be a target. 2 riders dressed simply, moving swiftly, we will draw far less attention. Besides, every hour we delay is an hour that Lady Ilara's mother slips closer to death. I will not waste time organizing a proper escort when speed is of the essence. He extended a hand down to Ilara. Can you mount without assistance? In answer, Ilara placed her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up onto the gray mare with a fluid grace that spoke of muscle memory. Even if the skill had not been practiced in years, she settled into the saddle, adjusting her seat and taking up the reins with confidence. As I said, my father taught me well, even if I did not know he was my father at the time. Then let us ride, Edmund said, and with a touch of his heels sent his destrier cantering toward the castle gates. They rode through the outer bailey where servants and guards paused in their work to watch the prince and the mysterious woman depart together. Speculation would be running wild by now, Edmund knew. The story of what had transpired in the great hall would have spread like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By tomorrow, half the castle would be convinced he had fallen madly in love with Ilara at first sight, while the other half would be certain she had bewitched him with some peasant magic. The truth, that he was simply trying to correct a terrible wrong, would likely seem far too mundane for the gossip-hungry courtiers. As they passed through the main gates and onto the road that wound down from the castle's hilltop position, the gray afternoon sky pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. The clouds that had threatened rain all morning were finally beginning to make good on their promise, and a light drizzle started to fall, misting their cloaks and the horses' manes with tiny droplets that caught the fading light like diamonds. How far to Ashford village? Edmund asked as they settled into a steady canter that ate up the miles without exhausting the horses. 15 leagues by the main road, Ilara replied, her voice raised slightly to carry over the sound of hoofbeats. But there is a shorter route through the forest that cuts nearly a third off the distance. It is rougher, less traveled, but I know it well from when my father would visit. The hesitation before the word father did not escape Edmund's notice. She was still adjusting to the knowledge, still processing what it meant to her sense of self. We will take your route, he decided. Every hour matters, as you said. Can you guide us even in the growing darkness? I could navigate that path blindfolded, Ilara assured him. I walked it dozens of times in my childhood, whenever Lord Thomas, whenever my father came to visit Margaret and me. He would bring gifts, small things that seemed like treasures to a child, a ribbon for my hair, a book of poems, once a wooden horse that he had carved himself with such detail that every muscle seemed ready to spring to life. Her voice grew distant with memory, and Edmund could hear both wonder and sorrow in her tone. Margaret would always grow nervous before his visits, insisting I stay inside, that I not speak to the other children about the nobleman who came to see us. I never understood why until today. She was protecting me, keeping the secret that Lord Thomas had entrusted to her. And he must have loved me so much to take such risks, to visit despite the danger of exposure, to carve toys for me with his own hands. My father spoke often of Lord Thomas, Edmund said, guiding his destrier around a deep rut in the road. He was the king's right hand, his most trusted friend and adviser. When he fell in battle against the Scottish raiders, my father grieved as though he had lost a brother. For weeks he could barely function, and when he finally emerged from his mourning, he was changed. Harder, more cautious, less willing to trust. He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I think, perhaps, that is where I learned to be as I am. I watched my father withdraw into himself, saw him raise walls against the pain of loss, and I, wanting to be like him, wanting to be strong, I built my own walls. But in doing so, I think I walled out not just pain, but compassion as well. I became so focused on order and law and control that I forgot the human element, the reality that every subject is a person with their own joys and sorrows, hopes and fears." Ilara glanced at him, and in her eyes, he saw a flicker of something that might have been understanding. "It is easy to forget, I think, when you live in a castle and command servants and have never known hunger or cold or desperation. Not that this excuses cruelty, but perhaps it explains it. You have lived your entire life at such a remove from the struggles of common people that we must seem almost unreal to you, like characters in a story rather than flesh and blood. That is uncomfortably accurate," Edmund admitted. The rain was falling harder now, and he pulled his hood up against the growing deluge. Beside him, Ilara did the same, though her cloak was already soaked through in places, the fur lining darkening with moisture. "But today you made me see very clearly that you are real, that your suffering is real, that the consequences of my actions are real. I do not think I will be able to forget that lesson, no matter how much distance time might provide." They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the rhythmic thunder of hooves on the packed earth road, the patter of rain on their cloaks, and the occasional jingle of tack as the horses shook their heads against the weather. The landscape around them was typical of the English countryside in autumn, rolling hills covered in grass that had begun to brown with the approaching winter, stands of trees with leaves in various stages of turning from green to gold to rust, fields that had been harvested and now lay fallow, waiting for spring. As they crested a hill, Ilara pointed toward a dark line of forest visible in the distance. "There," she said, "that is Thornwood Forest. The path I mentioned runs through the heart of it. We should reach the edge within the hour if we maintain this pace." Edmund studied the forest with a practiced eye. Thornwood was old growth, the trees ancient and thick, the undergrowth dense. It was the kind of place where bandits might make their camps, where travelers could disappear without a trace. But he had given his word that they would take the fastest route, and he was not about to go back on that promise simply because of potential danger. "Then we press on," he said, urging his destrier to greater speed. The rain intensified as they rode, transforming from a drizzle to a proper downpour that soaked through even the thickest wool and turned the road into a treacherous ribbon of mud. The horses' hooves began to slip and slide, forcing them to slow their pace for safety. By the time they reached the forest's edge, both riders were thoroughly drenched and shivering, their breath steaming in the cold air. The forest path that Ilara led them onto was barely visible, more of a game trail than a proper road, winding between massive oak and ash trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead that provided some small relief from the rain. The light, already dim from the overcast sky, faded to a murky twilight beneath the trees, and Edmund found himself relying increasingly on his horse's instincts and Ilara's guidance to navigate the twisting trail. "How much further?" he asked after what felt like hours but was probably less than one. "Perhaps 2 more hours at this pace," Ilara replied. Her voice sounded strained, and Edmund realized she must be approaching the limits of her endurance. She had been traveling for 3 days with little food or rest, had endured the trauma of her arrest and the revelation of her true identity, and now she was riding through a cold rain toward a village where her mother lay dying. That she had not yet collapsed was a testament to remarkable strength of will. "We should stop and rest," Edmund suggested, "just for a short while to let the horses catch their breath and to give you a moment to recover your strength." "No," Ilara said firmly. "Every moment we waste is a moment my mother might not have. I will rest when I know she is safe, not before. You will be no good to her if you fall from your horse from exhaustion," Edmund pointed out. 10 minutes. That is all I ask. There is a clearing ahead where we can shelter under the trees." Ilara looked as though she might argue, but then her shoulders sagged slightly in defeat. 10 minutes, she agreed. No more. They dismounted in the clearing Edmund had spotted, a small open space surrounded by ancient oaks whose thick trunks provided some protection from the wind. Edmund tied the horses' reins to a low branch where they could reach the grass, then pulled a blanket from his saddle pack and spread it on the ground beneath the largest tree. "Sit," he instructed Ilara, and when she hesitated, he added more gently. Please, you are shaking from cold and exhaustion. At least sit for a moment. She lowered herself onto the blanket with movements that were carefully controlled, as though she feared that if she relaxed even slightly, she would not be able to get back up. Edmund sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, and pulled out the provisions that had been packed for their journey. Bread wrapped in cloth, hard cheese, dried meat, and a flask of watered wine. Eat something, he said, offering her a portion of bread and cheese. You need your strength. Elara took the food mechanically and began to eat, though her movements were automatic, driven by necessity rather than hunger. Edmund watched her in the failing light, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she raised the bread to her lips, the way her eyes remained fixed on the forest path ahead, as though she could will their destination closer through sheer force of desire. Tell me about her, Edmund said softly. About Margaret, the woman who raised you. What was she like? Elara's chewing slowed, and for a moment, Edmund thought she might refuse to answer. Then she swallowed and spoke, her voice distant with memory. She is, the kindest person I have ever known. Strong but gentle, firm but loving. She taught me to read using an old book of scripture that her mother had given her. She would wake before dawn every day to work in our small garden, growing vegetables that she would share with neighbors who had even less than we did. She never spoke ill of anyone, never complained about our poverty or the hardness of our life. She paused, her hand moving to clutch at the fabric of her cloak. When I was 12, I fell ill with a fever. For 3 days I was delirious, burning with heat, and the healer said I would likely die. But Margaret never left my side. She bathed me with cool water, forced broth between my lips when I could barely swallow, prayed over me with such fervor that her voice grew hoarse. And somehow, I survived. The healer said it was a miracle, but I knew it was Margaret's love that pulled me back from death's door. Tears were flowing down her face now, mixing with the rain that still dripped from her hair and cloak. She sacrificed everything for me. She never married, never had children of her own, devoted her entire life to raising and protecting me, and I never even knew the full extent of what she had given up. I never understood the burden she carried, keeping such a secret for so many years, living in constant fear that someone would discover the truth and take me away from her. Edmund felt his throat tighten with emotion. She sounds like an extraordinary woman, he said quietly, a true mother in every sense that matters. She is, Elara said fiercely, turning to look at Edmund with eyes that blazed with determination despite her tears. And I will not let her die. I refuse to accept that after everything she has done, everything she has sacrificed, she should die in pain and poverty in a forgotten village while nobles feast in castles and debate matters of law and precedence. She deserves better. She deserves to be honored and cherished and given every comfort. And if I have to drag her back from death's door with my own 2 hands, that is precisely what I will do. The passion in her voice, the absolute conviction, struck something deep within Edmund. Here was someone who loved so completely, so without reservation or condition, that she would walk for days, steal from a prince, face down an entire court, risk everything for the sake of one person. It was a kind of love he had never experienced, never even truly witnessed. His own family loved each other, certainly, but it was a careful, measured kind of love, bound up in duty and propriety and the weight of generations of tradition. What Elara felt for Margaret was something purer, something fierce and beautiful, and utterly without calculation. We will save her, Edmund said, and he was surprised by the certainty in his own voice. I give you my word, Elara. We will do everything in our power to ensure Margaret survives this illness. The best physicians in the realm will tend to her, and she will want for nothing in terms of care or comfort. Elara searched his face in the dim light, looking for signs of empty promises or hollow reassurances. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and turned her attention back to the food in her hands. They ate in silence, the only sounds the steady patter of rain on leaves and the occasional snort from the horses as they grazed on the sparse grass of the clearing. When the 10 minutes had elapsed, they mounted again and continued deeper into the forest. The path grew narrower and more treacherous, forcing them to ride single file with Elara in the lead. Branches reached out like grasping fingers, catching at their cloaks and hair. The rain had turned the trail into a slick channel of mud that sucked at the horses' hooves with every step. Progress was agonizingly slow, and Edmund could feel Alara's frustration radiating from her like heat from a forge. Night had fully fallen by the time they emerged from the forest onto a road that was slightly wider and better maintained than the forest path. In the distance, perhaps half a league ahead, Edmund could see the faint glow of firelight from what must be the village of Ashford. It was a small cluster of lights in the darkness, perhaps 24 buildings at most, surrounded by fields that were invisible in the night, but which Edmund could imagine stretching out in all directions. "Almost there," Alara breathed, and Edmund heard the relief and fear warring in her voice. Relief that they had arrived. Fear of what they might find when they did. They urged their tired horses into a final canter, racing toward those distant lights as though all the demons of hell pursued them. As they drew closer, details began to emerge from the darkness. The village was indeed small, perhaps 20 cottages arranged in a rough circle around a central common area where a well stood. Most of the buildings were dark, their inhabitants either asleep or too ill to maintain fires. The few lights that burned came from windows covered with oiled parchment that glowed with the warm yellow of candlelight or the flickering orange of hearth fires. Alara pulled her mare to a halt before one of the cottages, a structure that was slightly larger than its neighbors but showed clear signs of disrepair. The thatched roof sagged in places, and even in the darkness, Edmund could see where the walls needed redaubing. She was off her horse before it had fully stopped, stumbling slightly as her feet hit the ground, her legs stiff from hours in the saddle. Edmund dismounted more carefully, taking a moment to tie both horses to a post before following Alara to the cottage door. She pushed it open without knocking, and the scene that greeted them made Edmund's heart clench with sympathy and horror. The interior of the cottage was a single room, sparsely furnished with a table, 2 chairs, a trunk for storing clothes, and a bed in the corner where a figure lay motionless beneath threadbare blankets. The air was thick with the smell of sickness, sweat, and fever, and something else, something that Edmund recognized from his sister's final days as the scent of approaching death. A single candle burned on the table, its light barely sufficient to illuminate the space. "Mother!" Alara cried, rushing to the bedside and falling to her knees. "Mother, I am here. I came back with help, just as I promised." The figure on the bed stirred slightly, and Edmund saw a hand emerge from beneath the blankets, reaching for Alara with trembling fingers. He moved closer, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and could now see the woman more clearly. Margaret Moore had once been beautiful. That much was evident despite the ravages of illness. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over elegant bones. Her hair, streaked with gray, lay damp with sweat against the pillow. Her eyes, when they opened, were the same warm amber as Alara's, though clouded now with fever and pain. "Alara," Margaret whispered, her voice so faint that Edmund had to strain to hear it. "You came back. I was afraid, so afraid that something had happened to you." "I am fine, Mother," Alara said, grasping Margaret's hand between both of her own. "I am here, and I brought help. This is Prince Edmund. He has come with medicine and supplies, and more help arrives tomorrow. You are going to be well. Do you hear me? You are going to recover from this." Margaret's fevered eyes moved to Edmund, widening slightly as she registered his presence. She tried to sit up to show proper respect to royalty, but Alara gently pushed her back down. "No, Mother, do not try to move. The prince understands. He is here to help, not to stand on ceremony." Edmund moved to the other side of the bed, setting down the medical supplies he had carried from his horse. "Lady Margaret," he said softly, and saw her eyes widen further at the title. "Yes, I know who you are, or rather, who you have been these many years. Alara has told me of your sacrifice, of how you raised and protected Lord Thomas's daughter as your own. You have my profound gratitude and respect." "Your Highness," Margaret began, then was seized by a violent coughing fit that racked her thin frame. Blood flecked her lips when the spasm finally subsided, and Edmund felt his jaw tighten with determination. The fever had progressed dangerously far, possibly too far, but he refused to accept that they had come this distance, only to watch her die. He began unpacking the medical supplies, laying them out on the table where the candlelight would allow him to see what he was doing. Willow bark for the fever, comfrey for the cough, poppy milk for the pain, clean bandages, a small bottle of spirits for cleaning wounds or sterilizing instruments. It was not much, not nearly enough for a case this severe, but it would have to suffice until the healers arrived tomorrow with their fuller kits and greater knowledge. "Ilara," he said, his voice taking on the tone of command that came so naturally to him. "I need you to start a fire in the hearth. A good strong one that will warm this room and allow us to heat water. Can you do that?" Ilara hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her mother's side, but she nodded and moved to the cold hearth. Edmund watched as she arranged kindling and logs with practiced efficiency, striking a spark with flint and steel that caught on the first try. Within minutes, flames were licking at the wood, and warmth began to radiate into the frigid room. "Now water," Edmund continued. "As much as you can carry from the well. We need to keep her fever down, and she needs to drink to replace what she is losing to sweat." As Ilara hurried out into the rain to fetch water, Edmund turned his full attention to Margaret. He mixed a small amount of willow bark powder into a cup of watered wine from his flask, stirring it until it dissolved. "Lady Margaret," he said gently, "I need you to drink this. It will help with the fever. Can you sit up enough to swallow?" With his help, Margaret managed to raise her head and take several small sips of the bitter mixture. She grimaced at the taste but forced it down, her trust in him evident despite her delirium. When she had consumed as much as she could manage, Edmund eased her back onto the pillow and placed a cool hand on her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin was alarming, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers. "Tell me," Margaret whispered when she had caught her breath. "Tell me she is safe, that revealing the truth has not put her in danger." Edmund met her amber eyes, so like Ilara's, and spoke with absolute sincerity. "She is safe, Lady Margaret, more than safe. She has been recognized as the daughter of Lord Thomas of Westmarch, and she will be afforded all the protection and privilege that her station demands. You have kept her safe all these years, and now it is our turn to keep both of you safe." Tears leaked from the corners of Margaret's eyes, tracking down her temples and into her hair. "I loved her," she whispered. "From the moment Lord Thomas placed her in my arms, I loved her as my own. I know I had no right, that she was never truly mine, but I could not help it. She was so small, so perfect, and Lady Helena, her true mother, was dying. Lord Thomas begged me to care for her, to protect her, and I swore I would. I swore on my life, and you kept that oath faithfully," Edmund assured her. "No mother, whether of blood or of choice, could have done better. Ilara is strong and kind and brave because of you. Whatever happens, you must know that you have succeeded in the task Lord Thomas set for you. His daughter has not merely survived, she has thrived, and that is entirely due to your love and sacrifice." Margaret's hand clutched at his sleeve with surprising strength. "Promise me," she gasped, another coughing fit threatening. "Promise me that if I do not survive this night, you will protect her. The court can be cruel, especially to those who do not fit neatly into their expectations. She has lived as a peasant for so long, she does not know the ways of nobility, the games they play. Promise me you will not let them destroy her spirit." The door burst open and Ilara staggered in carrying a heavy bucket of water, her cloak dripping and her face flushed with exertion. She set the bucket by the fire and immediately returned to her mother's side, taking Margaret's other hand in hers. "Do not speak of dying, mother," she said fiercely. "You are going to survive. I will not allow any other outcome." Edmund looked between the two women, seeing the love that bound them more surely than any blood tie ever could. He thought of his own mother, who had died bringing him into the world, a woman he had never known. He thought of his father, distant and cold in his grief. He thought of his sister Margaret, dead these 5 years, and how her passing had hardened him further against the pain of loss. And he realized that in all his life, he had never witnessed the kind of pure, unconditional love that existed between Ilara and the woman who had raised her. "I promise," Edmund said solemnly, speaking to Margaret but looking at Ilara. "I swear on my honor as prince of this realm that I will protect Ilara with everything at my disposal. She will never be alone, never without advocates, never at the mercy of those who would seek to harm or exploit her. This I vow." Over the next several hours they worked tirelessly to ease Margaret's suffering. Edmund prepared poultices and tinctures from the medical supplies, applying them according to the knowledge he had gained from watching healers tend to his sister during her final illness. Ilara bathed her mother's face and arms with cool water, changed her sweat-soaked nightgown for a clean one that Edmund found in the trunk, and spoke to her in a constant stream of soothing words, telling her stories from their shared past, reminding her of happy times and promising more to come. The fire burned bright and hot, warming the cottage and providing light to work by. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming on the thatched roof in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Inside, time seemed to slow and stretch, each minute lasting an eternity as they fought against the fever that threatened to claim Margaret's life. Sometime past midnight, Margaret's breathing began to ease slightly. The violent coughing fits that had been racking her body every few minutes decreased in frequency and intensity. Her fever, while still dangerously high, seemed to have peaked and was perhaps beginning to decline. Edmund allowed himself a cautious hope that the willow bark was working, that they had arrived in time to make a difference. "Rest," he told Ilara, who looked ready to collapse from exhaustion. "I will watch over her. You have been traveling for days without proper sleep. Your body needs rest or you will be of no use to anyone." "I cannot," Ilara protested, though her eyes were already drooping. "I need to be here if she wakes, if she needs something. She is sleeping peacefully now," Edmund pointed out, "and I will wake you immediately if there is any change in her condition. Please, Ilara, for her sake, if not your own, you must rest." After a moment's hesitation, Ilara nodded and moved to the second chair, curling up in it with her cloak wrapped around her like a blanket. Within minutes, she had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her breathing deep and even, her face relaxing into an expression of peace that Edmund had not yet seen on her features. He sat alone in the quiet cottage, listening to the rain and the crackling fire, watching the two women sleep. Margaret's hand lay on top of the blanket, and Edmund found himself reaching out to take it gently in his own, monitoring her pulse, feeling for any change in her condition. Her skin was still hot, but not as scorching as it had been. Her breathing, while labored, was steadier. She might survive this night after all. As he sat there in the dancing firelight, Edmund found his thoughts turning inward, examining his own actions and motivations with a ruthless honesty that he had rarely applied to himself before. He had built his entire identity around being just, being fair, being the embodiment of law and order. He had convinced himself that this made him a good prince, that his subjects benefited from his unwavering adherence to rules and precedent. But what good was law that did not account for mercy? What value was order that could not accommodate compassion? Ilara had forced him to confront these questions, to see himself as he truly was, rather than as he imagined himself to be. And the reflection she had held up was not flattering. He had been cruel, arrogant, and blind to the suffering of those he was meant to protect. The fact that he had not known Ilara's true identity was irrelevant to the fundamental wrongness of his actions. Every person, noble or common, deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. Every petition for help deserved to be heard and considered. Every subject of the realm had value that transcended their station or their usefulness to the crown. These thoughts should have been obvious, elementary truths that any child could understand. Yet he had lost sight of them, buried them beneath layers of pride and certainty and the conviction that his way was the only right way. It had taken a woman in rags, desperate and exhausted, to strip away those layers and force him to see clearly. He looked at Ilara's sleeping form, noting the way the firelight played across her features, highlighting the elegant bone structure that spoke of her noble heritage, the thick lashes that rested against her cheeks, the fullness of her lips slightly parted as she breathed. She was beautiful, he realized, truly beautiful in a way that transcended mere physical appearance. There was a beauty in her strength, in her fierce loyalty, in her refusal to bow before his authority when the stakes were too high to allow for submission. She had stood in his court and called him out for his failures, had challenged him to be better, and in doing so had sparked something in him that he had not known was missing. It was not love, he told himself firmly. He had known her for less than a day, and most of that time had been spent in conflict or crisis. What he felt was admiration, respect for her courage and her capacity for love. Perhaps also guilt, a bone-deep need to make amends for the harm he had caused her. Nothing more than that. Certainly nothing as foolish or impractical as romantic feelings. And yet, as he sat there holding Margaret's hand and watching Ilara sleep, Edmund could not quite convince himself that his denials were entirely truthful. There was something about her that called to him, that made him want to be the man she challenged him to become. Something that made him want to prove himself worthy of her good opinion, to show her that he could change, that he could learn from his mistakes and grow into someone better. Dawn arrived with a gradual lightening of the sky visible through the cottage's small window, the rain having finally ceased sometime in the early morning hours. Edmund had not slept, maintaining his vigil over Margaret throughout the long night, periodically checking her fever and administering small doses of the willow bark mixture. Her condition had stabilized, though she remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady, her fever reduced to a manageable level that no longer threatened immediate death. Ilara stirred in her chair as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the cottage, her eyes opening slowly and immediately seeking out her mother's form on the bed. "How is she?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Better," Edmund replied, and he was relieved to be able to speak truthfully. "The fever has broken, though she remains weak." She woke briefly around the 3rd hour past midnight, asked for water, and seemed to recognize me before falling back into natural sleep rather than fever-induced delirium. I believe she will survive, though her recovery will require time and careful attention. The relief that flooded Ilara's face was so profound that Edmund felt his chest tighten with emotion. She rose from the chair, moving stiffly as her muscles protested the hours spent in an awkward position, and came to stand beside the bed. She placed her hand on Margaret's forehead, feeling for herself the reduced temperature, and a sound that was half sob, half laugh escaped her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, and Edmund was not entirely certain whether she was speaking to him or to some higher power. Perhaps both. "Thank you for not giving up on her." "I gave you my word," Edmund said simply. "And I am learning, slowly perhaps, but learning nonetheless, that words must be backed by actions, or they mean nothing at all." A knock at the cottage door interrupted their conversation, and Edmund rose to answer it. He found himself facing a small group of villagers, perhaps a dozen men and women ranging in age from young adults to elderly, all wearing expressions of cautious hope, mixed with obvious exhaustion and illness. Several of them bore the telltale signs of the fever, flushed faces and glassy eyes, though none seemed as far advanced in the disease as Margaret had been. "Your Highness," spoke an elderly man who stood at the front of the group, his weathered face creased with lines of worry and suffering. "I am Thomas Ashford, the village elder. We heard that you had arrived with Lady Ilara, that you brought medicine. We do not wish to intrude, but there are many sick in the village, children especially, and we dared to hope that you might." His voice trailed off, the request implicit but unspoken. Edmund felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this moment was important, that how he responded would define not just the immediate situation, but the kind of prince, the kind of man he would be going forward. "Of course," he said, stepping aside to allow them entry. "Come in, all of you. Let me examine those who are sick and see what can be done with the supplies I have. The main relief expedition should arrive from the castle within a few hours with healers and additional provisions, but there is no reason to wait when I can provide some immediate assistance." The gratitude in their faces was humbling. They filed into the small cottage, filling it to capacity, and Edmund found himself thinking of the contrast between this crowded, humble space and the vast emptiness of the great hall where he had held court just yesterday. There was more genuine human warmth in this single room than in all the grandeur of Thornfield Castle. Over the next hour, Edmund examined each villager who showed symptoms of the fever, applying the same treatments he had used on Margaret. He mixed willow bark with water, showed them how to prepare cool compresses, explained the importance of keeping the sick warm but not overheated, of ensuring they drank sufficient fluids. His medical knowledge was limited, gleaned primarily from observation during his sister's illness and a few lessons from the castle physician, but it was more than these simple villagers had access to, and they listened to every word as though it were divine wisdom. Ilara worked beside him, translating his instructions into simpler terms when needed, adding her own knowledge of herbs and remedies that Margaret had taught her over the years. Edmund found himself watching her as she moved among her neighbors with easy familiarity, offering comfort and reassurance along with practical help. These were her people, he realized. She might have been born to nobility, but she had been raised here, had grown up alongside these children who were now adults struggling to survive. This was where she belonged, at least in her own mind, and extracting her from this community to install her in a castle would be like uprooting a tree that had grown deep roots. "Your Highness," spoke a young woman holding a child of perhaps 3 years, who burned with fever and coughed weakly against her shoulder. "My daughter Isabel. She has been sick for 5 days now. The healer said. She said there was nothing more to be done, that we should prepare ourselves for the worst. But I cannot accept that. Is there nothing you can do? Edmund took the child gently, laying her on the table where the light from the window would allow him to examine her properly. The little girl was thin, far too thin, her ribs visible through her skin, her eyes sunken and her lips cracked from dehydration. The fever had ravaged her small body, and Edmund could see why the village healer had despaired of saving her. In his mind, he saw his sister Margaret's face overlaid on the child's features, remembered holding her hand as she slipped away, despite all their efforts, all their prayers. "Ilara," he called, his voice steady despite the turmoil of emotion churning in his gut. "I need you to hold her while I prepare a stronger mixture of the fever remedy. And bring me honey if any can be found. We need to get liquid into her, and honey water will be easier for her to swallow than plain water." For the next 20 minutes, Edmund worked with single-minded focus, drawing on every scrap of knowledge he possessed. He crushed willow bark into a fine powder and mixed it with honey and warm water, creating a syrup that would be easier for the child to consume. He prepared a poultice of comfrey and other herbs for her chest to ease the coughing. He showed the mother how to position the child to help her breathe more easily, how to monitor for changes in her condition, what signs to watch for that would indicate improvement or deterioration. "She is very sick," Edmund told the mother honestly, refusing to offer false hope, but also refusing to consign the child to death. "The next day will be critical, but she is young and children can be surprisingly resilient. Keep her warm, keep giving her the honey water in small sips every few minutes, and watch her carefully. When the healers arrive, they will have stronger medicines that may help. Do not give up on her." The woman clutched her daughter close, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Your Highness. Thank you for trying, for caring. We never imagined a prince would what?" Edmund asked gently. "Would care about the lives of his subjects? Would work to ease suffering wherever he found it? If that has been your experience of royal authority, then I have failed you more profoundly than I knew, and I intend to ensure that such failures do not continue." As the morning progressed, more villagers arrived, drawn by word that the prince himself was tending to the sick. Edmund saw cases ranging from mild fever that required only basic care to severe illness that desperately needed the expertise of trained healers. He did what he could with limited supplies, all the while feeling the inadequacy of his efforts. These people needed proper physicians, well-stocked medicine stores, clean water sources, sufficient food to maintain their strength against illness. They needed the kind of systematic support that only a well-functioning government could provide, and that support had been absent, neglected by a prince too concerned with law and order to notice that his subjects were dying. Around midday, the sound of horses and wagon wheels announced the arrival of the relief expedition from the castle. Edmund stepped outside to find Sir Geoffrey leading a substantial group that included 3 healers, 2 wagons laden with supplies, and a dozen guards. The captain's weathered face showed relief at seeing the prince unharmed. "Your Highness," Geoffrey said, dismounting and bowing. "We made excellent time. The roads dried somewhat overnight, allowing us to travel faster than anticipated. We have brought everything you requested and more. Master Cedric sent additional medical texts he thought might prove useful, and the castle physician assembled enough supplies to treat a small army." "Excellent," Edmund said, gesturing toward the cottage and the growing crowd of sick villagers who had gathered outside. "As you can see, we have our work cut out for us. Deploy the healers immediately to begin triaging the worst cases. Set up one of the wagons as a temporary infirmary here in the common area, where people can be easily transported for treatment. And Sir Geoffrey, I want a full accounting of every village in the realm that has sent petitions for aid in the past year. We are going to review each one and ensure that help reaches everyone who needs it." As the relief expedition sprang into organized action, Edmund returned to the cottage to find Ilara sitting beside Margaret's bed, holding her mother's hand and speaking to her in low, soothing tones. Margaret was awake now, her eyes clear though still weak, and she smiled slightly as Edmund entered. "Your Highness," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been the previous night though still weak. "Ilara tells me you sat with me all night, that you tended to me yourself, rather than delegating the task to servants. I do not know what I have done to deserve such kindness from royalty." Edmund pulled up the second chair and sat facing her. You raised and protected the daughter of my father's dearest friend, he said simply. You kept her safe through years of hardship and danger, loved her as your own, taught her to be the remarkable woman she has become. If anything, Lady Margaret, it is I who does not deserve the privilege of serving you in your time of need. Margaret's amber eyes, so like Alara's, studied him with an intensity that belied her weakened state. She told me what happened at the castle, Margaret said quietly. How you treated her before you knew who she was. I will not pretend that hearing it did not pain me, did not anger me on her behalf. But she also told me what you have done since. How you rode through rain and darkness to bring help. How you have worked tirelessly to tend the sick. Actions speak louder than words, Your Highness, and your actions suggest a man capable of growth and change. I hope to prove worthy of that assessment, Edmund replied, though I suspect it will require sustained effort over a long period, rather than a single grand gesture. Old habits, old ways of thinking, they do not change overnight. No, Margaret agreed, but the willingness to change, the recognition that change is needed, that is the first and most important step. Many men, especially those born to power and privilege, never take even that first step. They remain convinced of their own rightness until the day they die, and the world is poorer for their stubbornness. Alara squeezed her mother's hand gently. You should rest, Mother. You are still weak, and talking takes energy you can ill afford to spend. I have spent 24 years keeping silent about matters of great importance, Margaret said with a slight smile. I find I have little desire to continue that pattern now that the truth is known. But you are right, as always, my dear one. I am tired, and I should rest while I can. As Margaret's eyes drifted closed, Alara rose and gestured for Edmund to follow her outside. They stood in the weak autumn sunlight, watching as the healers moved among the villagers with practiced efficiency, setting up treatment areas and beginning to administer more sophisticated care than Edmund's basic remedies had allowed. I have been thinking, Alara said, her gaze fixed on the activity before them rather than on Edmund, about what happens next after the immediate crisis is resolved. I do not belong at court, Your Highness. I have no training in the ways of nobility, no understanding of the games and intrigues that Master Cedric warned me about. I would be a disaster in that environment, an embarrassment to my father's memory and to you. Edmund felt a sharp pang of something that might have been disappointment, though he pushed it aside. What are you saying? That you wish to remain here in Ashford, to continue living as a peasant despite your true identity? Not as a peasant, Alara corrected, but perhaps as someone between worlds. I could use whatever resources my father's estate provides to help this village and others like it. I could be a bridge between the common people and the nobility, someone who understands both perspectives and can advocate for those who have no voice in the halls of power. Would that not be a worthwhile purpose? It would, Edmund acknowledged, but it would also be a terrible waste of your potential. You have the bearing, the intelligence, and the strength of character to thrive at court if you choose to. Yes, there would be challenges, adjustments to make, skills to learn, but I have no doubt you could master them if you wish to try. Alara turned to look at him directly, her amber eyes searching his face. And why should I wish to try? So I can spend my days in a castle, wearing fine dresses and attending endless dinners where people speak in riddles and smile while plotting each other's downfall. So I can become like the other noble ladies I saw in your hall, concerned primarily with fashion and gossip and securing advantageous marriages. That is not the life I want, Your Highness. That is not who I am. Then do not become like them, Edmund said with sudden intensity. Be yourself, exactly as you are. Be the woman who walked 3 days to save someone she loved. Be the person who stood before a prince and called him out for his cruelty without fear or hesitation. Be the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. The court does not need another Lady Catherine making polite conversation and worrying about the quality of her gowns. It needs someone like you, someone real and honest and unafraid to challenge the comfortable assumptions of those in power. He paused, then added more quietly, and I need someone like you, to remind me when I start to slide back into old patterns, to force me to see beyond the narrow confines of law and precedent to the human cost of my decisions. You have already made me a better prince in the space of a single day. Imagine what you could accomplish if you chose to remain and continue that work. Alara's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. You speak as though you believe I could make a real difference. But I am one person, Your Highness. And you are asking me to enter a world where I have no allies, no support, no understanding of how things work. How long before the other nobles grind me down, before I am forced to either conform or be ostracized? You would not be without allies, Edmund said firmly. You would have me, and Master Cedric, who has already shown himself to be a friend to you. And my father, when he returns, he loved Lord Thomas like a brother and will welcome his daughter with open arms. Beyond that, you would be surprised how many people at court are hungry for genuine connection, for someone who speaks honestly rather than in careful political calculations. You would find friends, I am certain of it. Before Alara could respond, one of the healers approached, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and capable hands. Your Highness, Lady Alara, I have examined Lady Margaret, and I must report that while her fever has indeed broken and she is no longer in immediate danger, she remains very weak. She will require weeks of careful nursing to fully recover, and she should not be moved from this cottage until she has regained more strength. The journey to the castle would be too taxing in her current state. Then I will stay here, Alara said immediately, before Edmund could speak. I will not leave her when she needs me. The court can wait, or it can do without me entirely. My place is with Margaret until she is fully recovered. The healer nodded approvingly. That would be best, my lady. She will heal faster with you by her side. Familiar faces and voices can work wonders that medicine alone cannot achieve. She paused, then added gently, though I must warn you, recovery from a fever this severe is rarely simple. There may be setbacks, moments when it seems she is improving only to worsen again. You must be prepared for a difficult journey ahead. I understand, Alara said, her jaw set with determination. I have nursed her through illness before, and I will do so again for as long as it takes. Edmund felt torn between admiration for her loyalty and frustration at the situation. He needed to return to the castle, to resume his duties, and begin the work of addressing all the neglected petitions that Sir Geoffrey had mentioned. Yet the thought of leaving Alara here, of returning to his cold castle and his empty routines while she remained in this small village, filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. I will leave 2 of the healers here, he decided. They can assist you in caring for Margaret and tend to the other villagers who remain ill. Sir Geoffrey will organize regular supply runs from the castle to ensure you have everything you need, and I will return myself within a fortnight to check on Margaret's progress and to discuss your future plans. Alara met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection that neither fully understood but both felt keenly. Thank you, Your Highness, for everything you have done, for the help you have provided. Whatever else may have passed between us, whatever harsh words were spoken in anger or ignorance, this kindness will not be forgotten. It is not kindness, Edmund said quietly. It is duty, responsibility, and perhaps the beginning of understanding what those words truly mean. You taught me that, Alara. You showed me that being a prince is not about enforcing laws or maintaining order at all costs. It is about protecting and serving the people who depend on you, about recognizing their humanity and responding to their needs with compassion as well as justice. Over the next several hours, Edmund worked with Sir Geoffrey and the healers to establish a more permanent infrastructure for caring for the village. The cottage next to Margaret's, which stood empty after its occupants had died in the early days of the fever, was commandeered as a proper infirmary. Supplies were unloaded and organized, treatment protocols established, a rotation of healers and assistants arranged to ensure continuous care for those who needed it. Edmund also took time to meet with Thomas Ashford and the other village elders, listening to their accounts of how the fever had spread, what resources they lacked, what support they needed, not just for the immediate crisis, but for long-term survival. He learned that the early frost had indeed devastated their harvest, that their grain stores were dangerously low, that without assistance they would face starvation before spring arrived. He learned of other problems too, a bridge that had collapsed and not been repaired, making it difficult to transport goods to market, a dispute with a neighboring village over water rights that threatened to turn violent, a series of thefts that suggested bandits had taken up residence in the nearby forest. Each problem he heard added weight to the growing realization of how profoundly he had failed in his duties. These were not new issues that had arisen overnight. They were ongoing situations that had been festering for months or even years while he sat in his castle, confident in his righteousness, dismissing peasant concerns as beneath his notice. The scope of his negligence was staggering, and he knew that Ashford was likely just one of many villages suffering similar neglect. As the afternoon wore into evening, Edmund found himself back at Margaret's cottage, sitting once again by her bedside while Alara prepared a simple meal of bread and cheese from the supplies the expedition had brought. Margaret was awake, propped up on pillows, her color better than it had been, though she still looked terribly frail. "Tell me about my father," Alara said suddenly, setting down the knife she had been using to slice bread. "I have fragments, memories of a tall man who smelled of leather and horses, who would lift me onto his shoulders and carry me around the garden while Margaret pretended to scold him for getting me overexcited. But I do not really know who he was, what kind of man he was. Will you tell me, Your Highness?" Edmund leaned back in his chair, gathering his thoughts. Lord Thomas was, in many ways, everything a nobleman should be. He was brave in battle, wise in council, generous to those in need, and absolutely loyal to my father and to the realm. I was only 11 when he died, but I remember him vividly. He had a way of making people feel heard, of giving his full attention when you spoke to him regardless of whether you were a fellow lord or a stable boy. He laughed easily and often, finding joy in simple things. A good meal, a well-told story, the beauty of a sunset. He paused, remembering. He also had a fierce sense of justice, though his justice was tempered with mercy in a way that mine has not been. I remember once a servant was caught stealing food from the kitchens. The usual punishment would have been flogging and dismissal. But Lord Thomas investigated and discovered that the servant's family was starving because her husband had been injured and could not work. Instead of punishment, he arranged for the husband to receive medical care and found the man a position in the castle that did not require heavy labor. That was who he was, someone who looked beyond the surface to understand the full story before passing judgment. Alara's eyes had filled with tears as she listened. "He sounds wonderful. I wish I had known him, truly known him as my father, rather than as a kind stranger who visited occasionally. Do you think he would be disappointed in me? In the life I have lived, in the person I have become?" "Disappointed?" Edmund repeated, genuinely shocked by the question. "Alara, he would be immensely proud of you. You embody all the qualities he valued most: courage, compassion, loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice for those you love. The fact that you were raised in poverty rather than privilege does not diminish those qualities. If anything, it makes them more remarkable because you developed them without the advantages of noble education or the expectation of living up to a family legacy." Margaret spoke up from the bed, her voice weak but clear. "Lord Thomas came to see you as often as he dared, my lady. Every few months he would arrive under cover of darkness, spending only a few hours before departing again to avoid detection. He would hold you and tell you stories, teach you small things, rhymes and songs and the names of stars. And he would give me detailed instructions about your upbringing, what values to instill, what skills to teach. Everything you are, everything you have become, it was shaped by his wishes, even if you did not know he was your father." "Why did he not bring me back to court after my mother died?" Alara asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Was he ashamed of me? Did he not want to acknowledge me as his daughter?" "No," Edmund said firmly. "Never that. He kept you hidden to protect you. Those were dangerous times, Alara. There were factions within the court who opposed my father's rule, who plotted rebellion and assassination. Lord Thomas had many enemies among those factions, nobles who resented his influence with the king, who saw him as an obstacle to their ambitions. If they had known about you, known that Lord Thomas had a daughter, they would have used you as a weapon against him, a way to control or hurt him. He chose to keep you safe in obscurity rather than risk exposing you to such danger." He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. "He planned to bring you back once the political situation stabilized, once it was safe to acknowledge you publicly. But the stabilization never came, and then he fell in battle, and the knowledge of your location died with him. Or so we thought. The messenger he sent, the one who carried the information to my father, he must have been intercepted or killed before he could deliver his message. We searched for any trace of Thomas's daughter after his death, but without knowing where to look, our efforts came to nothing." The cottage fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the healers working in the makeshift infirmary next door. The weight of lost years, of a childhood that could have been but never was, hung heavy in the air. Alara wiped at her eyes, then squared her shoulders in a gesture that Edmund was coming to recognize as her way of pushing through difficult emotions. "Then I will honor his memory by being the kind of person he wanted me to be," she said quietly. "Whether I do that at court or here in Ashford, I will make choices that would make him proud. I will help people who need it, fight against injustice, and refuse to let hardship or cruelty break my spirit. That is the legacy I choose to claim from a father I barely knew." Edmund felt something shift in his chest, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the woman sitting across from him. She was extraordinary, he realized, not despite her humble upbringing, but perhaps because of it. She had known suffering and hardship, had experienced firsthand the consequences of neglect and indifference from those in power, and instead of becoming bitter or broken, she had emerged with her compassion intact and her determination to help others stronger than ever. "I should return to the castle tomorrow," he said, though every part of him resisted the idea. "There is much work to be done, petitions to review, policies to change, a realm to govern better than I have been. But I meant what I said. I will return in 2 weeks to check on Margaret's progress and to continue our conversation about your future." "I will be here," Alara said simply, "caring for my mother and helping my village. Whatever decisions need to be made about court and nobility and my father's legacy, they can wait until she is well. That is my priority, and I will not be swayed from it." As the evening deepened into night, Edmund prepared to take his leave. The healers had established their routines, the villagers had been provided with supplies and instructions, and there was little more he could accomplish by remaining. Sir Geoffrey had arranged for him to stay the night in the village elder's cottage, a slightly larger structure that could accommodate a royal guest with some degree of comfort, but Edmund found himself reluctant to leave Margaret's cottage, reluctant to end this time with Alara. "Your Highness?" Margaret called softly as he moved toward the door. "A moment, if you please." Edmund returned to her bedside, kneeling so that their faces were level. Up close, he could see the toll the illness had taken, the gray pallor of her skin, the tremor in her hands. But he could also see the strength in her amber eyes, the same fierce determination that her daughter possessed. "I am going to say something that may seem presumptuous coming from a woman of my station," Margaret said quietly, her gaze flicking to where Alara stood by the fire, far enough away that she could not hear their whispered conversation. "But I find that nearly dying gives one a certain freedom to speak uncomfortable truths." "I am listening," Edmund said, curious and slightly apprehensive about what she might say. "You care for her," Margaret stated bluntly, "not as a prince concerned for a subject, not as a man seeking to make amends for past wrongs, but as something more. I can see it in how you look at her, how you listen when she speaks, how you came alive when you thought you might lose the chance to know her better." "Do not bother denying it. I am too old and too observant to be fooled by protestations." Edmund felt heat rising in his face, a flush of embarrassment and surprise at being so thoroughly read by a woman he had known for less than a day. That is, we have only just met under the worst possible circumstances. Whatever I might feel, it is far too soon to name or act upon it." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded, "but feelings do not wait for convenient timing or ideal circumstances. They arise when they will, regardless of whether we are ready for them. What matters is what you do with those feelings, how you choose to act or not act upon them." She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Alara has been hurt, Your Highness. Not physically, but in her heart and in her sense of who she is. The revelations of today have shaken her foundations, and she will need time to rebuild herself, to integrate her new understanding of her identity with the person she has been for 24 years. If you truly care for her, if what I see in your eyes is genuine, then you must be patient. You must let her come to you in her own time, on her own terms. Do not press, do not demand, do not use your position or your power to influence her choices." "I would never," Edmund began, but Margaret cut him off. "You might not intend to, but the imbalance of power between a prince and a woman who has only just learned she is nobility, it creates pressure even when none is meant. Be her friend first, her advocate, her supporter. Show her through sustained action that the man you were in that hall is not the man you truly are or wish to be. And if, after time has passed and she has healed, if she chooses to give you her heart, then you will know it is a gift freely given rather than one extracted through obligation or gratitude." Edmund nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom in her words. You love her very much. More than my own life, Margaret said simply. She is my daughter in every way that matters, and I will do whatever necessary to protect her, even if that means protecting her from a prince who might hurt her unintentionally through impatience or assumption. Do you understand what I am telling you? I do, Edmund said, and he meant it. And I give you my word. I will be guided by your counsel. I will be patient. I will earn her trust through actions rather than words, and I will never use my position to pressure or manipulate her into anything she does not freely choose. Margaret studied his face for a long moment, then nodded, satisfied. Good. Then you may go with my blessing, such as it is. Return in 2 weeks as you promised, and we will see where things stand then. The 2 weeks that followed Edmund's departure from Ashford Village were among the most transformative of his life. He returned to Thornfield Castle with a new sense of purpose, a burning determination to remake himself into the kind of prince his subjects deserved, rather than the cold arbiter of law he had been. The change did not go unnoticed by the courtiers, who whispered among themselves about what could have happened in that small village to so profoundly alter their prince's demeanor. Edmund's first action upon returning was to summon Sir Geoffrey and demand every petition, every request for aid, every plea for help that had been received and set aside over the past year. The pile of documents that arrived in his chambers was staggering, nearly 3 feet high, representing hundreds of subjects whose needs had been ignored or dismissed as unworthy of royal attention. Edmund set about reading each one personally, working late into the night by candlelight, his eyes burning with fatigue but his determination unwavering. What he found horrified him. There were villages suffering from famine, towns plagued by bandits, families torn apart by disputes over land that could have been easily resolved with proper arbitration. There were widows seeking compensation for husbands killed in the king's service, veterans of past wars begging for assistance after injuries left them unable to work, children orphaned by disease asking for shelter and protection. Each petition represented real people with real suffering, and each one that had gone unanswered was a mark against his conscience. Edmund began responding immediately, dispatching aid where it was most urgently needed, sending investigators to verify claims and assess situations, establishing new procedures to ensure that future petitions would be read and addressed promptly, rather than filed away and forgotten. He worked with a fury that surprised even himself, driving his scribes and administrators to exhaustion as they struggled to keep pace with his demands. Master Cedric, observing these changes with approval, came to Edmund's chambers one evening as the prince hunched over yet another stack of documents. "Your Highness," the old scholar said gently, "you have been working without rest for days. You must take care of yourself, or you will be no good to anyone." "There is too much to do," Edmund replied without looking up from the petition he was reading, which detailed a village's desperate need for a new well after their water source had been contaminated. "Every hour I rest is an hour that someone suffers needlessly. I will not allow that to continue." "Noble sentiments," Cedric acknowledged, settling into a chair across from Edmund's desk. "But even the most dedicated prince is still human, still subject to the limitations of flesh and blood. You cannot single-handedly solve every problem in the realm, no matter how desperately you might wish to." Edmund finally looked up, his gray eyes shadowed with exhaustion but burning with intensity. "Then what would you have me do, Master Cedric? Go back to how things were before? Ignore the suffering I now see clearly because addressing it all is too overwhelming?" "Of course not," Cedric said patiently. "But there is a middle path between willful ignorance and self-destructive obsession. You are implementing systemic changes, establishing new procedures, training others to help carry this burden. These are good and necessary actions. But you must also trust others to execute your vision, delegate responsibilities to capable people, and preserve your own strength for the long battle ahead. This is not a sprint, Your Highness. It is a marathon that will require sustained effort over years, perhaps decades." Edmund leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "You are right, of course. I suppose old habits die hard, the need to control everything personally, to trust only my own judgment. But that mindset is what created this crisis in the first place, is it not? My certainty that I alone knew best, that others could not be trusted to make important decisions." "The ability to recognize one's own failings is the beginning of wisdom," Cedric observed, "and you have demonstrated remarkable growth in that area over the past fortnight." May I ask what prompted this transformation? I do not believe it was merely the revelation of Lady Alara's identity, though that certainly played a role. Something else happened in Ashford Village, something that changed your perspective fundamentally. Edmund was silent for a long moment, considering how to articulate thoughts and feelings that he had not fully examined even in his own mind. I saw myself clearly for the first time, he said finally. Not as I imagined myself to be, just and fair and righteous, but as I truly was. Cold, arrogant, blind to suffering because acknowledging it would have required me to question my own certainty. And I saw what that blindness had cost, not in abstract terms, but in real human faces. A child burning with fever, an old woman dying because help came too late, a village suffering because their petitions were dismissed as unimportant. He paused, his hands clenching into fists on the desk. But I also saw what was possible when I chose compassion over law, mercy over rigid adherence to rules. I saw Margaret begin to recover because we acted quickly rather than waiting for proper procedures. I saw hope return to people who had given up on receiving any help from their prince. And I understood, perhaps for the first time, that power is not about control or enforcement. It is about service, about using the resources and authority at my disposal to improve the lives of those who depend on me. A profound realization, Cedric said softly, and one that many rulers never achieve in their entire lives. Your father will be pleased when he returns and sees the changes you have implemented. The mention of King Harold reminded Edmund that his father would be returning within the week, and that there would be much to explain. The incident with Alara in the Great Hall had surely reached the king's ears by now through the constant flow of messengers between the castle and the northern borders. Edmund could only hope that his subsequent actions would demonstrate genuine transformation rather than merely temporary guilt. As if reading his thoughts, Cedric said, "You know that your father will have heard about what transpired with Lady Alara. The question is whether he will see it as a catastrophic failure of judgment or as a learning experience that has made you a better leader. I suspect the answer will depend largely on what he finds when he returns, on whether the changes you have made are superficial or substantive. Then he will find substantive change," Edmund declared. "Because I do not intend to revert to my old ways, regardless of how comfortable or familiar they might be. I have seen too much, learned too much, to go back to willful blindness." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, and Sir Geoffrey entered, bearing a sealed letter. "Your Highness, a messenger just arrived from Ashford Village. He says the matter is urgent and requested that this be delivered to you immediately." Edmund's heart lurched in his chest as he took the letter, his hands suddenly unsteady. Was it Margaret? Had her condition worsened? Had something happened to Alara? He broke the seal with fumbling fingers and unfolded the parchment, his eyes scanning the contents rapidly. The letter was in Alara's hand, her script clear and elegant despite obvious haste in the writing. "Your Highness," it began, "I write to inform you that Margaret's recovery has progressed remarkably well over the past 2 weeks. The healers you left with us have been invaluable, and her strength returns more each day. However, a new crisis has emerged that requires immediate attention. A band of raiders attacked a caravan traveling between Ashford and the neighboring village of Millbrook 3 days ago. They killed 2 guards and made off with supplies meant to help both villages survive the winter. The raiders have established a camp in Thornwood Forest and are threatening further attacks unless tribute is paid. The village elders are terrified and have no means to defend themselves. I would not trouble you with this except that people are in danger, and I know of no one else who might help. Please come if you can. Alara." Edmund was on his feet before he had finished reading, his exhaustion forgotten in the surge of alarm that flooded through him. "Sir Geoffrey, assemble a force of 20 men, our best fighters. We ride for Ashford within the hour, and send word to the castle armory that I will need my sword and armor prepared immediately." "Your Highness," Cedric protested, rising from his chair. "Surely this is a matter that could be delegated to the captain of the guard." "You need not personally lead every military expedition, especially not when you have been working yourself to exhaustion for 2 weeks straight. This is not about delegation," Edmund said, already moving toward the door. "This is about Alara and the people of Ashford being in danger. I will not sit safely in my castle while they face threats I could help address. Besides, what better way to demonstrate that my transformation is genuine than by taking personal action to protect subjects I once dismissed as beneath my concern?" Within the hour, Edmund was mounted on his black destrier, armored in leather and mail, a sword at his hip and determination in his heart. The 20 men Sir Geoffrey had assembled were seasoned fighters, veterans of border skirmishes and bandit hunts, men who knew how to handle themselves in combat. They rode hard through the afternoon and into the evening, covering in hours what had taken a full day on Edmund's previous journey, because they followed the main road rather than the forest path, and because their horses were fresh and well rested. They arrived in Ashford village as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Edmund incongruously of Alara's eyes in firelight. The village looked better than it had 2 weeks ago, the signs of sickness less evident, people moving about with more energy and purpose. But there was also a tension in the air, a nervousness in how the villagers watched the forest edge as though expecting attack at any moment. Alara emerged from Margaret's cottage as Edmund and his men rode into the village common. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, her hair braided and pinned up in a practical style, and in the fading light, she looked every inch the noblewoman she had been born to be, though she seemed entirely unaware of it. Her face lit up with relief when she saw Edmund, and she hurried forward to meet him as he dismounted. "You came," she said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice, as though she had not truly expected him to respond so quickly to her summons. "I was not certain my letter would reach you, or if it did, whether you would think the matter important enough to warrant personal attention." "Of course I came," Edmund said, resisting the urge to reach out and touch her, to reassure himself that she was unharmed. "You asked for help, and beyond that, you and this village are under my protection. I would be a poor prince indeed if I ignored such a clear threat to my subjects' safety." He turned to address the assembled villagers who had gathered at the sound of horses. "I understand you have been terrorized by raiders from the forest. I need to know everything you can tell me about them. How many, what they are armed with, where exactly their camp is located, what demands they have made. Leave nothing out, no detail is too small." Thomas Ashford stepped forward, the elderly village elder looking even more careworn than he had 2 weeks ago. "Your Highness, there are perhaps 15 to 20 men in the raider band, based on what the survivors of the caravan attack reported. They are well armed with swords and bows, and they fight with the skill of trained soldiers rather than common bandits. Their leader is a man called Black Robert, known in these parts as particularly vicious and cunning. He sent a message 3 days ago demanding that we provide him with half our winter stores, plus any valuables the village possesses, or he would burn Ashford to the ground." "And have you responded to this demand?" Edmund asked, his voice hard. "We sent word that we would need time to gather what he asked for," Thomas replied. "We have been stalling, hoping that help would arrive before we were forced to comply or face attack, but his patience will not last much longer. He gave us until tomorrow at sunset to deliver the tribute, or he promised that blood would flow." Edmund felt cold fury building in his chest. These raiders were not desperate men stealing to survive. They were predators deliberately targeting vulnerable villages, exploiting the fear and helplessness of people who had no means to defend themselves. It was exactly the kind of injustice he had sworn to fight against, and he would not allow it to continue. "You will not give them 1 grain of wheat or 1 copper coin," Edmund declared, his voice carrying across the common so that all could hear. "Tomorrow at sunset I will be waiting for Black Robert and his men with a message of my own. Any man who threatens the subjects of this realm, who preys on the weak and the defenseless, will face the full consequences of royal justice, and that justice will be swift and absolute." He turned to Sir Geoffrey. "Deploy the men around the village perimeter. I want guards posted at every approach, watches maintained throughout the night. If the raiders attempt an attack before tomorrow's deadline, I want us ready to respond immediately, and send 2 scouts into the forest to locate their camp and observe their movements. I want to know exactly what we are facing." As Sir Geoffrey moved to carry out these orders, Alara touched Edmund's arm gently, drawing his attention back to her. "Thank you," she said quietly, her amber eyes reflecting the last light of the sunset. "For coming so quickly, for taking this seriously. I know you have many demands on your time and attention. It means more than I can say that you made this a priority." "You are a priority, Alara," Edmund said before he could stop himself, then felt heat rise in his face as he realized how his words might be interpreted. He quickly added, "That is to say, the safety of all my subjects is a priority, and you in this village are very much included in that." I will not allow raiders to terrorize people under my protection. Alara studied his face in the fading light, and Edmund thought he saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips, as though she understood exactly what he had almost said and was choosing to let it pass without comment. "How is Margaret?" he asked, changing the subject to safer ground. "Your letter said she was recovering well. Come and see for yourself," Alara said, gesturing toward the cottage. "She has been asking about you, wondering when you would return. I think she will be pleased to know you came so quickly." They walked together through the gathering darkness, and Edmund was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the way her shoulder occasionally brushed his arm, the scent of lavender that clung to her hair. He remembered Margaret's counsel about patience, about letting Alara come to him in her own time, and he forced himself to maintain proper distance, even as every instinct urged him closer. Inside the cottage, Margaret sat propped up in bed, a marked improvement from the unconscious, fever-ravaged woman Edmund had left 2 weeks ago. Her color was better, the gray pallor replaced by a more natural tone, and though she was still thin and weak, there was life in her amber eyes and strength in her voice when she greeted him. "Your Highness," she said warmly, "Alara said she had sent for you, but I confess I did not expect you to arrive so swiftly. Surely a prince has more pressing matters than raiders threatening a small village." "On the contrary, Lady Margaret," Edmund replied, taking the chair beside her bed that had become familiar during his previous visit. "There are few matters more pressing than ensuring the safety of my subjects. Besides, I made a promise to return in 2 weeks, and I am only a day early. I would not want to be accused of breaking my word." "A day early and arriving with armed men to defend us from danger," Margaret observed. "I would say that exceeds the requirements of promise-keeping by a considerable margin." She paused, her sharp eyes studying him with an intensity that made Edmund slightly uncomfortable. "You have changed, Your Highness. Even in the 2 weeks since I last saw you, there is something different about you. Less rigid, perhaps, more open. I have been trying to learn from my mistakes," Edmund said quietly, "to become the kind of prince my subjects deserve rather than the one I have been. It is not easy work, and I suspect I will stumble many times along the way, but I am committed to the effort." "And how goes this effort?" Margaret asked. "Has the court accepted these changes, or do they resist the transformation of their prince?" Edmund smiled ruefully. "There is resistance, certainly. The nobles who benefited from the old ways, who enjoyed their privileges without corresponding responsibilities, they are not pleased with my new expectations. But there are also those who have embraced the changes, who seem relieved to have a prince who considers the welfare of all subjects rather than just the titled and wealthy. Master Cedric has been invaluable in navigating these political waters and helping me identify allies among the court." Alara, who had been preparing a simple meal at the small table, spoke up without turning around. "And the petitions you mentioned, the ones that had been ignored, have you addressed those?" "Every single one," Edmund confirmed. "Some required immediate action, aid to villages facing starvation or attacks like the one you now face. Others needed investigation to verify claims or assess situations. But each has received a response, and systems are now in place to ensure that future petitions are read and addressed promptly. It has been exhausting work, but also deeply satisfying. For the first time in my life, I feel as though I am actually serving my people rather than merely ruling over them." "That is a significant distinction," Margaret said approvingly. "Many rulers never grasp the difference between the two. The fact that you have learned it at your age, before ascending to the throne, suggests you may become a truly great king someday." The conversation was interrupted by Sir Geoffrey's arrival at the cottage door. "Your Highness, the scouts have returned from the forest. They have located the raiders' camp and have important information to report." Edmund rose immediately. "I will return shortly," he told Margaret and Alara, then followed Geoffrey outside to where 2 men waited, their clothes dark and mud-stained from creeping through the forest. "Report," Edmund commanded. The older of the 2 scouts, a grizzled veteran named Thomas, spoke first. "Your Highness, the camp is located about 2 leagues into Thornwood Forest, in a clearing near a stream. We counted 18 men, all armed and showing signs of military training. Their leader, the one they call Black Robert, is a big man, heavily scarred, carrying a sword that looks to be of good quality. We observed them for several hours, and from their conversation, we learned that they are not common bandits." "What do you mean?" Edmund asked, his attention sharpening. They spoke of orders from someone they called the Lord, though they never mentioned a name. The second scout, a younger man named Peter, interjected. They seemed to be following a specific strategy, targeting villages in this region systematically, weakening them and creating fear. One of them said something about preparing the ground for something bigger to come. Edmund felt a chill run down his spine. This was not simple banditry motivated by greed. This was organized, deliberate, part of some larger plan. Did they mention anything else? Any clues as to who this lord might be or what their ultimate goal is? No, Your Highness, Thomas said. But their equipment is too good for common outlaws, and their discipline too strong. These are trained soldiers, possibly deserters from someone's army, being directed by someone with resources and plans beyond simple theft. Edmund's mind raced, considering implications and possibilities. Could this be related to the unrest that had sent his father to the northern borders? Were these raiders part of a larger conspiracy against the crown? He needed more information, but first, he needed to deal with the immediate threat to Ashford village. How defensible is their camp? Edmund asked. If we were to attack, what would we be facing? The camp is well chosen, Thomas admitted. The clearing is surrounded by dense forest that would make it difficult to approach without being detected. They have sentries posted, and the stream at their back provides both water and a potential escape route. A direct assault would be costly, possibly resulting in significant casualties on our side. Then we will not make a direct assault, Edmund decided. We will use their own strategy against them. They expect us to be weak and frightened, to comply with their demands or cower in fear. Instead, we will appear to comply while setting a trap. Tomorrow, when they come to collect their tribute, we will be waiting. He spent the next several hours with Sir Geoffrey and his men, planning every detail of the ambush. The village would appear to be preparing the demanded tribute, loading wagons with supplies and gathering what valuables could be found. When Black Robert and his raiders arrived to collect, they would find themselves surrounded by Edmund's armed men, hidden in cottages and behind walls, ready to strike at his signal. It was well past midnight when the planning was complete, and Edmund finally allowed himself to rest. He returned to Margaret's cottage to find Alara still awake, sitting by the fire and mending a tear in one of her mother's dresses. She looked up as he entered, the firelight casting warm shadows across her face. "You should be sleeping," Edmund said gently. "Tomorrow will be dangerous, and you will need your strength." "I could say the same to you," Alara replied, setting aside her mending. "You have been traveling and planning for hours. Surely you are exhausted." "I am," Edmund admitted, sinking into the chair across from her. "But my mind will not settle enough to allow sleep. There are too many uncertainties, too many things that could go wrong tomorrow." "Tell me your plan," Alara said. "Perhaps speaking it aloud will help organize your thoughts." Edmund explained the ambush strategy, watching as Alara listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. She had a sharp mind, he noted, quick to grasp tactical concepts and identify potential weaknesses in the plan. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, her gaze fixed on the dying fire. "It is a good plan," she said finally. "But it relies on Black Robert behaving predictably, on him bringing most or all of his men to collect the tribute. What if he suspects a trap? What if he sends only a few men while keeping the majority back at his camp? Then we adapt," Edmund said. "We capture or kill whoever he sends and use them to extract information about the main force. It is not ideal, but it is better than allowing him to continue terrorizing this region unchecked." Alara nodded slowly, then turned her amber eyes to meet his gray ones directly. "You are risking your life for us, for this village and the people in it. Why? I understand that you feel guilty about how you treated me initially, that you want to make amends and prove you have changed. But surely there are safer ways to demonstrate that transformation than personally leading an attack on armed raiders." Edmund was silent for a long moment, considering how to answer honestly without revealing too much of what he had begun to feel for her. "Because," he said finally, "I have spent my entire life at a remove from the consequences of my decisions. I made judgments from the safety of my castle, sent others to enforce those judgments, and never had to witness personally the results of my choices. That distance made it easy to be cruel, to prioritize law over compassion, to forget that every decision affected real people with real lives." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. But you changed that, Alara. You forced me to see clearly, to confront the human cost of my arrogance. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. Now, when I make a decision that puts people in danger, I feel compelled to share that danger rather than sending others to face it on my behalf. Does that make sense? It does, Alara said softly. Though I worry it may also get you killed. A dead prince cannot help anyone, no matter how noble his intentions. I do not intend to die tomorrow, Edmund assured her with a slight smile. I am well trained in combat, and I will have 20 skilled fighters at my back. The odds are in our favor, provided we execute the plan correctly. Promise me something, Alara said suddenly, her voice intense. Promise me that if the situation becomes too dangerous, if things start to go wrong, you will retreat rather than fighting to the death out of some misplaced sense of honor. Promise me you will survive because the realm needs you. A prince who cares, who actually tries to help his people, that is rare and valuable. Do not throw that away in a single battle against raiders. Edmund felt his breath catch at the emotion in her voice, at what might be concern, or might be something deeper. I promise, he said quietly. I will not take foolish risks. I will fight smart rather than recklessly, and I will return safely to continue the work of becoming the prince I should have been all along. They sat together in companionable silence as the fire burned down to embers, neither quite willing to break the spell of the moment. Finally, Alara rose and moved toward the small pallet that had been set up for her in the corner of the cottage, separate from Margaret's bed. Sleep well, Your Highness, she said, and may tomorrow bring justice rather than tragedy. Sleep well, Alara, Edmund replied, watching as she settled onto the pallet and pulled a blanket over herself. He remained by the fire for a while longer, his mind churning with thoughts of the coming day and the woman sleeping just a few feet away. Margaret's words echoed in his memory. Be patient. Let her come to you in her own time. He could do that, he told himself. He could wait, could prove through sustained action that his feelings were genuine and his transformation real. And perhaps if fortune smiled upon him, perhaps someday Alara would see him not as the cruel prince who had humiliated her, but as someone worthy of her affection and respect. The next day arrived with gray skies and a cold wind that promised winter's approach. Edmund and his men took their positions before dawn, concealing themselves in cottages and behind walls, while the village appeared to go about the business of preparing tribute for the raiders. Wagons were loaded with sacks that looked like grain but were actually filled with sand and stones, barrels that appeared to contain salted meat but held only water and scraps. It was all for show, a carefully constructed illusion designed to lure Black Robert and his men into a trap. Alara had insisted on remaining in the village despite Edmund's protests, arguing that her absence would seem suspicious to raiders who might be watching. She moved among the cottages with apparent nervousness, playing the role of a frightened villager convincingly. Edmund watched her from his concealed position, admiring her courage and her quick thinking. The sun climbed toward its zenith, then began its descent toward the western horizon. As the deadline approached, tension mounted throughout the village. Edmund's men gripped their weapons, eyes scanning the forest edge for any sign of movement. The villagers who had been visible earlier had retreated to their cottages, leaving the common area empty except for the loaded wagons and a few men playing the role of village elders, waiting nervously for the raiders. The attack came suddenly, without warning. Instead of waiting for sunset as promised, Black Robert and his men burst from the forest in mid-afternoon, their strategy clearly designed to catch the village off guard. There were indeed 18 raiders, just as the scouts had reported, all armed and moving with military precision as they swept into the village. Now! Edmund shouted, and his trap was sprung. His men poured from their hiding places, surrounding the raiders on all sides. The element of surprise was complete, and for a moment, the raiders stood frozen in shock. Then Black Robert, a massive man with a scarred face and cold eyes, roared an order, and his men drew their weapons, forming a defensive circle in the center of the common. You are surrounded, Edmund called out, stepping forward with his sword drawn. Surrender now and you will be given fair trial. Resist and you will die here. Choose quickly. Black Robert's laugh was harsh and mocking. A prince playing at soldier, he sneered. Your father would be ashamed to see his heir risking himself for a handful of peasants. Tell me, boy, do you even know how to use that fancy sword? Or is it just for decoration? I know how to use it, Edmund replied calmly, though fury burned in his chest at the disrespect. And I will demonstrate if you force me to. Last chance, Black Robert. Surrender or face the consequences. In answer, Black Robert charged, his sword raised high, bellowing a war cry that was taken up by his men. The battle was joined in an instant, steel clashing against steel, shouts and screams filling the air. Edmund met Black Robert's charge, their swords meeting with a force that sent shocks up Edmund's arms. The raider leader was strong, brutally so, each blow carrying enough power to shatter bone if it landed cleanly. But Edmund was faster, his training under the castle's master-at-arms paying dividends as he parried and countered, looking for openings in Black Robert's defense. Around them, the battle raged as Edmund's men fought the raiders with disciplined efficiency. The element of surprise and superior numbers were telling, and already several raiders had fallen or thrown down their weapons in surrender. Black Robert saw his men falling and fought with increased desperation, his attacks becoming wilder and less controlled. Edmund waited for his moment, then struck, his blade slipping past Black Robert's guard to open a deep cut across the raider's sword arm. The big man howled in pain and rage, but his sword arm weakened, his grip faltering. "Yield," Edmund commanded, his blade at Black Robert's throat. "It is over. Your men are defeated. Yield and live." For a moment Edmund thought the raider might choose death over surrender. Then Black Robert's sword clattered to the ground and he sank to his knees, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. "I yield," he spat. "Take your victory, princeling. But know this, you have won a battle, not the war. There are forces moving in this realm that you cannot imagine, powers that will sweep away everything you think you know. Then perhaps you will tell me about these forces," Edmund said coldly, signaling for his men to bind the prisoner. "We have much to discuss, you and I." The battle had lasted less than 10 minutes. 5 raiders lay dead, 3 were wounded but alive, and the rest, including Black Robert, had surrendered. Edmund's men had suffered only minor injuries, a testament to their training and the effectiveness of the ambush. As the prisoners were secured and the wounded tended to, Ilara appeared at Edmund's side, her face pale but her eyes bright with relief. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You saved us. You actually saved us." "We saved you," Edmund corrected gently, gesturing to his men who were efficiently securing the prisoners and searching them for hidden weapons. "This was a team effort, carefully planned and well executed. I merely provided direction." Before Ilara could respond, a commotion arose among the men searching the prisoners. One of Edmund's soldiers approached carrying a leather pouch he had taken from Black Robert. "Your Highness, you need to see this." Edmund opened the pouch and found several items that made his blood run cold. There was a substantial amount of gold, far more than common raiders should possess. There were detailed maps of the region showing villages, roads, and defensive positions. And there was a letter, sealed with wax, bearing an unfamiliar crest, a black tower on a red field. Edmund broke the seal and read the letter, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Sir Geoffrey with grim determination. "Send riders to the castle immediately. My father must be informed that we have uncovered evidence of a plot against the crown." These raiders were not acting independently. They were being funded and directed by Lord Blackthorne, a noble I had thought loyal, but who apparently harbors ambitions of rebellion. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled men. Lord Blackthorne was a powerful noble with lands in the western reaches of the kingdom, a man who commanded significant military forces and had always presented himself as a staunch supporter of the crown. If he was indeed plotting rebellion, the implications were staggering. "What does the letter say?" Ilara asked quietly, standing close enough that only Edmund could hear. Edmund hesitated, then decided she had earned the right to know. "It instructs Black Robert to continue terrorizing villages in this region, to create instability and fear, to undermine faith in the crown's ability to protect its subjects. It speaks of preparing the way for a larger action, though it does not specify what that action might be, and it promises substantial rewards once the new order is established." "A rebellion," Ilara breathed. "Lord Blackthorne intends to rebel against your father's rule." "So it would seem," Edmund confirmed, "though we will need more evidence before we can move against him openly. A noble of his power and influence cannot be accused lightly." We must be certain, and we must be prepared for what will follow when we make our accusations public. As the prisoners were loaded into wagons for transport back to the castle, Edmund gathered the villagers of Ashford to address them. They stood in a circle around him, their faces showing a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering fear. "The immediate threat has been neutralized," Edmund announced, his voice carrying clearly across the common. "But I will not pretend that all danger has passed. These raiders were part of a larger conspiracy, and we must remain vigilant. I am leaving 5 men here as a permanent garrison to protect this village and the surrounding area. They will report directly to me, and any threats, any suspicious activity should be brought to their attention immediately." He paused, looking around at the faces before him, seeing not peasants or subjects, but people, individuals with names and families and lives that mattered. "I also want to apologize to all of you. The fact that you were vulnerable to such attacks, that you had to endure weeks of fear while waiting for help that should have come immediately, that is a failure of leadership. My failure. I promise you, things will be different going forward. Your safety and welfare are not secondary concerns to be addressed when convenient. They are primary responsibilities that I take seriously." Thomas Ashford stepped forward, his weathered face creased with emotion. "Your Highness, we never expected a prince to risk his own life for our sake, to fight beside common soldiers against raiders threatening a small village. What you have done here today, the example you have set, it gives us hope that perhaps the realm can be governed with both strength and compassion." As the villagers dispersed to begin the work of cleaning up after the battle and returning to their normal routines, Edmund found himself alone with Alara near Margaret's cottage. The afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the village common, and in its light, Alara looked more beautiful than ever, her amber eyes reflecting the golden glow. "I need to return to the castle," Edmund said reluctantly. "This evidence must be presented to my father immediately, and preparations must be made for whatever comes next. But I want you to know, Alara, that these past weeks, knowing you, learning from you, they have been transformative. You challenged me to be better, and I am trying every day to live up to that challenge." Alara was quiet for a moment, her gaze steady on his face. Then she stepped closer, close enough that Edmund could smell the lavender in her hair, could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. "I misjudged you as well," she said softly. "In the Great Hall, I saw only cruelty and arrogance. I did not see the capacity for growth, for genuine change. You have proven that my initial assessment was incomplete. You are not the man I thought you were, Edmund. You are better." It was the first time she had used his given name without his title, and the intimacy of it sent warmth flooding through Edmund's chest. "Alara, he began, but she placed a gentle finger on his lips, silencing him. "Not yet," she whispered. "You have work to do, a conspiracy to uncover, a realm to help protect, and I have decisions to make about my future, about who I am and where I belong. But when the immediate crises have passed, when we both have had time to think clearly without the pressure of danger and urgency, then we can have the conversation that I see in your eyes you want to have." Edmund nodded, understanding and respecting her wisdom. She was right, of course. This was not the time for declarations or commitments. There was too much uncertainty, too much still unsettled. But the promise in her words, the acknowledgement that a future conversation might be possible, was enough for now. "Until then," Edmund said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both courtly and deeply personal, "I will work to be worthy of whatever future we might have together. I will be the prince this realm needs, the man you challenged me to become. And I will hope that when all the storms have passed and the dust has settled, you might see fit to give me a chance to prove that my heart is as changed as my actions." Alara smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face and made Edmund's breath catch in his throat. "I look forward to that conversation, Your Highness. Ride safely and know that you carry with you the hopes and prayers of everyone in Ashford Village." As Edmund mounted his horse and prepared to depart with his men and their prisoners, he looked back one final time at Alara standing in front of the cottage, the afternoon sun creating a halo around her figure. In that moment, he made himself a silent vow. He would root out this conspiracy, protect the realm from those who would tear it apart for their own gain, and he would prove himself worthy not just of the throne he would someday inherit, but of the remarkable woman who had forced him to see himself clearly and given him the chance to change. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and dangers he could only begin to imagine. But for the first time in his life, Edmund felt truly ready to face whatever came, fortified not by arrogance or certainty, but by humility, compassion, and the knowledge that he had found someone worth becoming better for. As he rode away from Ashford Village, the setting sun at his back and his future spread out before him like an unwritten story, Prince Edmund Thornfield allowed himself to hope, to believe that perhaps the cruelty and coldness of his past could be transformed into the wisdom and warmth of his future. And in that hope, in that possibility of redemption and love, and a life devoted to genuine service rather than mere rule, he found a purpose more fulfilling than any he had known before.